Well, Peter, last time we spoke, we were talking about Shakey when we last spoke, and we had talked about we had sketched out your kind of evolving roles in the project. We had talked about Charlie Rosen's conception of the Shaky Project as this kind of integrative platform for all these different strands of research in what we might call artificial intelligence. And so I would like maybe to return us to Shaky and to ask two questions of you to kind of get us back into the flow. One would be, well, to reflect your reflections on the importance of Shaky first for you, and then in general for kind of the advance in the story of computing and robotics. So personally and then historically, if you will.
Okay, good. Well, thank you again. I don't recall if last time I answered your first question, the importance for me personally, I don't recall if I related this story about how there was one incident with Charlie that really was a turning point for me. Did we talk about
the chest? What are you afraid of?
Yes.
Yes.
Was that there? Okay.
It was.
So,
yes.
So that was one. Really, only in hindsight can I appreciate how it really was a turning point for me, and changed my attitude ultimately towards risk, towards personal risk. What do you risk by trying something new, uncertain outcomes? And I might have last time continue with the story about how I consulted for the British government.
We did not.
Well, that's an interesting, perhaps an interesting little sidelight.
That'd be wonderful.
So while I was still in my SRI portion of my career, but I think it might have been after the Shaky Project ended, I consulted with a small group of people for the British, it was variously called the Ministry of Industry or the Department of Industry or something like that. It was a cabinet level department. And the question this small group of us, maybe no more than half a dozen at most, were asked to address was, why didn't Britain have more entrepreneurship? They pointed out that Britain had a glorious history of innovation, going back to the earliest days of computers, the invention of what they call the B-box, and today is called the index register, but very little commercialization. And we spent a week consulting with or being visited by the top strata of the British establishment, the financial sector, the city, as they call it with a capital C, the academic sector, the labor unions, trade unions, the government people, the civil service bureaucracy, quite a cross-section of the kind of leadership community. And they said, well, what can we do? And they used words like Britain is sclerotic, arthritic, et cetera. We can't ever seem to get commercialization. And so there was a lot of stroking of beards and so forth. And I had a hypothesis, which I can by no means prove, but I think is a somewhat interesting one. And I thought the reason that they really had such a small deal flow, we spoke to their very small venture capital community, we were told, you know, our deal flow, the opportunities to invest, is a tiny fraction of what you see in Silicon Valley. And my conclusion was that it was because of the penalty of failure. So, and I later discovered a very parallel situation in Japan when I spent, you know, I visited Japan maybe 75 times. Very similar in that respect. And the issue is this, that if you try something in the British business cultural community, like a startup, and you fail, my impression, not being ever having lived there, but my impression, listening to all these really very informed, well-educated people, was that it was kind of a black mark on you for life. And I asked one of the people there, I said, well, if I tried to do a startup and it was, I'll call it a noble failure, great attempt, but outside forces, you know, et cetera, we failed. Would people say, you know, good enough chap that heart but you did hear about his. And I put it that bluntly, and this other gentleman said, that's absolutely right. It's not that I could never get another job, but it would always be remembered. And the contrast I'll offer is that one time I was at a fundraising event, actually, and it was quite a distinguished group of people, including some venture capitalists. And one venture capitalist, very prominent person in the Valley who I'll leave unnamed, who I was acquainted with, but no more than that, came to me and he said to me, Peter, he said, you know, I heard about your last company, which happened after 8 years to have been a victim of the biggest recession before 2008. Maybe we'll get to that part of the story later, but in any case, for this story, he said, I heard about your last company. He said, I know it was a big deal for you, but nobody else here gives a. He said, your next business idea, you bring it to me first. And so the contrast between that and the many years earlier story in Britain, I thought was really striking. That if you had a startup here that didn't do what you hoped for, you got some experience, we learned more from our failures and our successes, et cetera, et cetera. In this culture, in the American culture, whatever negatives you might have, a fabulous attribute is you get to try as many times as you want. You can step up to the plate and take as many cuts as you want. You don't do well in school, you drop out, try again. You drop out again, try again. You want to do something, go to junior college. You drop out, try again. Oh, you made it through, now you can go to four-year school. Many other countries in the world are nothing like that. In Japan or in Britain, if you do poorly on some nationwide test in your adolescence, my understanding is that you get tracked this way and never that way. Again, I'm not an expert, that's my impression. Our culture is very different. You fail at anything, and assuming you haven't done something truly reprehensible, you get to try again. And that's a marvelous, I think, underappreciated aspect of our society around these parts, at least. And it's a long story about the poke in the chest from Charlie and what are you scared of? What's the worst that can happen? If you fail at this, you can still try again. And that kind of closes the loop on that somewhat lengthy digression.
When was that UK
It was in the late 1970s. It might have been around 78 or 9 or sometime around then. So the Shaky Project ended in 72.
Okay.
And this was some years later. I suppose I was the director of the Artificial Intelligence Center at SRI in those days. So getting back to your question, what did the Shaky Project mean for me? So that turning point was a really big deal. It flipped a switch in my mind. I was much better able to accept risk. And from that point on, I accepted increasingly large personal risks. And, you know, it all turned out just fine, even though every particular venture didn't turn out as I hoped. No regrets, no complaints about my path. So that was a big deal. The other thing that was a big deal for me personally was that, as I think I might have mentioned last time, there was so little that had been done in artificial intelligence up to that point that there was so much low-hanging fruit, and we could just pick at every place you looked. Another aspect of that was that, again, because there was so little that had been done, you could, every couple of years, say, move to a different, what today would be considered a very narrow subspecialty of artificial intelligence, and actually make meaningful contributions because there wasn't 1,000 papers to catch up on or something like that. There was almost no prior art. And so over a period of a handful of years, say half a dozen years, I was able to work in automatic problem solving and planning, in a lot of work in computer vision and scene analysis, a lot of work in heuristic search and shortest paths and so forth. Today, each of those is their own field, and it would take there'd be quite a high switching cost. kind of context switching cost for a researcher to move from one to the next to the next. But back then, any of us, I wasn't anything special, any of us could move, not every 6 months, but maybe every couple of years, to an entirely new area, whatever we needed to do for Shakey, whatever we needed, whatever we found interesting for ourselves. So that was, and some of my, I suppose I've been cited quite a few times, and my most cited work all stems, I think, from that period.
Did it feel at the time that you were shifting areas, or did it seem like you were just exploring new questions in kind of this general area?
It was pretty clearly a shift of disciplines. Okay. So, for example, the work that we did on the A-star shortest path algorithm, I mean, it took a stroke of insight. Somebody once asked me, was it inspiration or perspiration? It was mostly inspiration. A bit of perspiration followed, but it was mostly inspiration. But then it was formal mathematics. We proved theorems. I don't remember if we covered that. I think we did, yeah. That was quite different from robot planning, problem solving, execution monitoring, and error recovery. You didn't prove theorems about that. You invented algorithms. Right. And then in computer vision, again, a different story. So we all thought of it as AI. We didn't make any distinction between AI and robotics. At least I didn't. But it was pretty obvious that we were using different technical tools to address different open problems. Then, getting on to your second question, what did Shakey mean for the field? What was the... Right. So a few years ago, I think I might have pointed this out in the previous session, people around the world noticed that it was the 50th anniversary of Shakey by some measure of whenever it started. Yeah. And so for 2 or 3 years, various AI and robotics conferences really around the world were having special plenary celebration sessions, panels, talks on Shakey. And I went to several of them, spoke at several of them, and so on, as did Nils Nilsson and other, real notables of the time. And one of the big questions that came up was, what was Shakey's biggest contribution? And everybody had a point of view, and I can offer mine.
That would be great.
My point of view was that it was no single algorithmic or narrowly defined technical contribution. Some people said A-star was really a big deal because, as you know, now it's used everywhere. People use it every day without, of course, knowing what's under the hood. I thought that the big deal about Shakey, and again, none of us foresaw this at the time. This is all 20/20 hindsight. I think the big deal about Shakey was the totality of the existence proof, that it was possible to build an autonomous vehicle, we called it in those days, robot if you like, that could perceive its environment, could solve problems for which it had no previously programmed solution, that it could execute that solution in the real world, that it could monitor how is it doing, because things go wrong in the real world. It could correct, it could overcome errors of execution, and it could even learn in a certain sense by using plans that it had computed for the solution of future problems. It could take a plan, generalize it in a certain sense, and say, I could use this in some future problem by applying it, changing variables, and so on and so forth. So it was the totality, in my opinion, that this was possible. Before Shakey, it really was science fiction, as I'm sure I pointed out previously. And now, although Shakey was so limited, particularly in its mechanicals, which were primitive even then because none of us were very good at that, And of course, nowadays the mechanicals are just really look primitive. And in spite of the very confined computing environment that we talked about last time, it was possible to do this. And that, I think, gave a lot of other people the idea that, you know what, we can do that better. We can develop better mechanicals, controls, and that really the field of robotics for decades moved over into really the control theory aspects. How do you make a two-wheeled walker and that sort of, I mean a two-legged walker and so on. We can do much better on the mechanical design and the control of that. We can get more sophisticated layered architectures for the software. We can do a lot better on computer vision. And of course, nowadays, from the perspective of 2018, it's phenomenal what's possible. And so I think Shakey really gave a lot of very smart people all over the world the confidence that, yeah, not only is this possible, but we can do better. And that's how research fields get initiated, and that's how progress gets made.
Yeah, I have used in the past the phrase "a faith in the future," that you see there's a development, there's an analysis where the research community sees it and it says, "Yep, there's nothing." This opens up a line where there's no obvious brick wall. You know, we can push along this line, and we have enough confidence, faith from these results that we're willing to invest our career, which is a precious resource, in pushing this, and that it can have meaning. You know, it's toward a meaningful end.
Well, I love that view. I love that view, and I'll offer a couple of complementary or supplementary versions of that. One is there was a lot of headroom. Sometimes I tell people that the reason you invest in basic research is the same reason that you plant trees. It's to benefit future generations. And that's not quite the same as your phrasing, but I like yours very much. It's complementary. The other thing I'd say, the no brick walls. You know, I supervised a lot of research over many, many years. Hopefully always trying to hire people smarter than me who would do better than I would do. But I did learn a thing or two about how you kind of manage, how you head up research centers. And sometimes I would ask a researcher two things, and this is going to circle back to your view.
Sure.
Two questions. The first question is, what's your dream? If you don't have a dream, I'll give you some time to formulate one. But if you don't ever have a dream, I sort of wonder whether you should be pursuing some other chosen profession. Because research is about trying to make dreams come true. And so we could talk about this. My second question is, so what are you going to do next Monday? And the thought was that if you have a dream, but you have no idea how to get started, I'm pretty sure it'll never be more than a dream. And I sometimes told the story how when I was a kid standing on the shore of a lake, I used to dream that I could figure out how to make things weightless and invisible. And great dream, but when I got a little older, I realized I didn't have a clue as to what to do next Monday on that, so I relinquished that dream, you know. So back to the Shakey context, I would say that Shakey showed that there could be a dream, and that's your comment that there's a future, there's a faith in the future, and you know what to do next Monday because here's Shakey already. Your next Monday's job is make it better.
Right.
So there's no brick wall. You know how to get started because there's a platform of sorts that you know at least this much is possible. It's not like weightless and invisible. Right. You know this much is possible. Right. Do better. So I really like your phrasing. I'll just offer these as a little different perspective on the same concept.
Yeah, and even if you're going to wildly divert, if it turns out, you know, using wheels, forget it later on, you have that, you know what to do on Monday to see if wheels are going to pan out. you know.
Right.
Do you think that this the power of example, of having this integrated example of a robot that could accomplish these performances, do you think that was in Charlie Rosen's mind as why this integrative platform would be, you know, why he came up with that idea of an integrating platform? Or do you think that it was, well, what do you think? Was that in his mind, that if successful, you would have this powerful example, or?
Well, I wish Charlie were here to ask him that. I don't think we really can know that. I knew Charlie extremely well, worked with him daily for 15 years. And as I pointed out, was really my most important mentor. But I don't know the answer to that question. I can tell you what I think I've said previously, which was the idea that the idea behind what became Shakey was that it was a means for integrating all these previously separate subdisciplines as artificial intelligence was then constituted. And I think I probably previously went through that litany of vision and so on and so forth. And what might round out the picture a little bit about Charlie is that I think I've mentioned that he had a remarkably integrative intellect, that he had this extremely broad base of knowledge, and he could associate ideas from very disparate fields that at first blush would have nothing to do with each other, and he put them together and you'd say, you know, maybe something's possible there. Maybe from 3 different, apparently very disparate fields. And so remembering Charlie's very associative, integrative kind of thing, I think it very much appealed to him that if you pull together these very separate subdisciplines of AI, vision, planning, learning, etc., in one integrated system, things are going to happen that you can't predict. And that's what makes it a very valuable research enterprise. And as I previously said, it took years to sell that, but my goodness, was it ever worth it?
Why did the Shaky project end? Why not just continue and, you know, build a, you know, better version?
Strictly government funding.
Okay.
We were eager to continue it. We wanted, after about 5 years, to build a completely new generation. The concept was, and this is going to be very interesting if you think of the decades-long story, we wanted to build an office assistant that we called the general factotum, was the working title. Factotum is somebody who does stuff for you. Right. We didn't care what the physical embodiment was exactly, whether it was a sleeker wheeled vehicle or legged or whatever. But we wanted it to be not a reconnaissance vehicle, which was the founding premise for Shakey, but an office assistant that would do stuff for you, help you with your daily tasks, do your scheduling or your whatever it was, or shuffle papers when we were a little bit more paper intensive in those days and so on. And ARPA would have none of it. We had other funding, but ARPA was by far the cornerstone, might have been 80% of everything or whatever, I don't remember. And they were done. I can't remember whose reign it was at ARPA then. I can't remember if it was George Heilmeyer or Colonel, I can't remember his name now. But in any case, they were done. They would have none of it. We switched the gears a bit to talk about having an assistant that would help with maintenance tasks. For example, how do you maintain a high-tech fighter aircraft? Right. And how would you help a maintenance technician? And there were ideas around that, but they would have none of it. And so that was the end. To come back to, I said I would connect that with years later. Decades later, there was a program at SRI and about 20-odd research centers around the country You'll have to help me remember the name. It was to make an office assistant.
Yeah, or
What was it called?
I don't know, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
Somebody
I'm
watching
ashamed to
this will
say.
remember the acronym
Yeah.
and the name. I think that SRI was a sort of a prime contract, or at least
Or
a
was the
central,
integrating contractor or something
or the
like
integrating
that?
contract,
Yeah,
or something
yeah,
like that,
yeah.
and had a piece of the research. And there was, I think, between 20 and 30 research centers. I think Tom Garvey at SRI might have been a principal person there. In any case, I was at SRI for decades at that point, so I'm not the correct source, but my understanding is that that's what's led to Siri.
I believe that is absolutely the case.
And so Siri was the office assistant or the personal assistant, except it could live in your phone. It didn't actually need a physical embodiment walking around an office and shuffling papers, because what's paper nowadays? But it is interesting that we had that idea somewhere around 1971 when we saw the end of the Shaky funding program to be in 1972. And SRI, of course, lives then and lives today on contracts and grants.
It is also interesting to me that this is just kind of across the way as Xerox PARC gets set up. It too is focused on the office of the future.
Of course. And some of, and some people who had worked in various capacities, both in the AI Center, but more prominently with Doug Engelbart's group right down the hall. He was down the hall from me. Doug and I and our wives used to go backpacking together and so on. So that's what really seeded an important piece of the PARC stuff. And of course, the rest, as they say, is history. But yeah, we Nils and Bert Rayfield and I and Dick Duda and one or two other people perhaps really wanted this office assistant project to be the successor to Shakey, but funding wasn't there and we had to move in other directions.
Was the activity, do you think you came to that focus on the office of the future independently, or was it was there a lot of, or was it kind of just clear that this was a fascinating area because of discussions generally about office automation and?
No, I mean, I suppose all of us are influenced by our intellectual milieu in ways that might be hard to tease apart. So, maybe some stuff from PARC, Xerox PARC, then seeped in. Mm-hmm. Who can remember the exact conversations at this remove? But the office was not our focus. The focus was the individual. So maybe that's a distinction without a difference, but we were focused on how do you help the individual. I want a personal factotum. We had secretaries in those days, but it was one or two secretaries for 30 or 40 or many, many people, so you had a very small timeshare or time slice or bandwidth. And so it's like, I want more of that help. Mm-hmm. So if you think of Shakey as a physical embodiment, rolling around the smooth linoleum or tile floors, why can't that be somebody for me?
Right.
So it was really very much, the concept, the proposals we wrote were very much along the lines of a personal assistant. I want somebody to help me. And I guess if everybody has one, that office automation in some sense, but it wasn't, what do we do for the office? It's like, how do you help me?
Right, I see the difference. Maybe one other question, if I may, on Shakey, and it's all of these performances that it was able to exhibit. Did you then have, I guess it's almost about thinking of Shakey as a science project about learning something about human intelligence or the nature of intelligence, no matter where it is embodied? Or did you see it as more of an engineering technology project to create a system that can, exhibit these, perform these designed functions?
That's a great question. I think probably all of the above in all of the principal researchers at one time or another in different combinations. So, for example, I think I may have mentioned already that we were very interested in everything from the neurophysiology of the occipital cortex, because when we were doing computer vision, it's like, how did mammals do it? How do frogs do it? If we only knew the wiring diagram, wouldn't that help us build better algorithms? So there was some of that. I think I might have already mentioned that Nils Nilsson and I made a pretty serious study of what then was called brain science, which is a combination of neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, even cognitive psychology, and so forth. If we could figure out how does it work in nature, wouldn't that give us some hints about how to build computer programs? But the flip side also, artificial intelligence and really pretty much all of engineering, computer science including, are synthetic disciplines. We build stuff. They're not scientific disciplines in the sense of particle physicists. We're trying to take apart the universe and see the smallest things they're composed of. So they're synthetic disciplines. They're what Herb Simon calls sciences of the artificial, I suppose. So we ultimately were interested in building things. But to go to your question and the flip side of that, once you have models that do stuff, they at least provide some intellectual ingredients or grist for the intellectual mill to create models of how stuff might work in nature. And so the time-worn example is birds. And birds don't flap, planes don't flap their wings. That was tried 2,000 years ago, it didn't work. But in trying to build planes, we did learn a lot about aerodynamics, which is a scientific side of things, fluid dynamics, compressible fluids, and so on and so forth. And I'm by no means an expert, but I would imagine that anybody who wants to understand how birds, natural organisms, fly, probably would be well advised to learn something about aerodynamics to try to figure that out. It provides a model, or at least some of the ingredients of a model, for the natural phenomenon you're trying to understand. And so, in the same vein, if we had synthetic models that work to some extent, that might suggest some model. If you go back through history, people always use the most complex artifact to explain the brain. Long ago, clockworks, 300, 400 years ago, mechanical clockworks were models for the mind, the most complicated artifact people had built, perhaps. And then when computers, when IBM first built computers, they were giant minds. They were, human brains. Well, far from it. But that's been, the long tradition that you use these synthetic models as at least suggestions for how you model real-world phenomenon and create scientific theories.
Right. So in that way, it's interesting. Listening to you describe it that way, this kind of model building and as a way for, reasoning about how nature works. Is it kind of a ordinary science, if you will, and perhaps what's interesting is but somehow when we're talking about artificial intelligence, the discussion, my impression is, gets somehow more fraught. And maybe it's because we're applying it to ourselves, rather than a bird where we don't think that.
Not too threatening.
Right. It's not threatening to think a model may inform our understanding of how a bird flies.
Yeah, I think you might very well be right, David. I don't know that I can add any perspective to that, but I'll offer you one example that to me is deeply ironic. If we can fast forward to today's or yesterday's headline AI news. So I've already mentioned that we were very interested in learning about the anatomy and physiology of natural neural systems, because if we only knew the wiring system, the thought went, wouldn't that give us hints? And I think I referred to the Hubel and Wiesel Nobel Prize winning work that goes back decades and decades now about recordings in the occipital cortex to show that certain organisms have edge detectors and movement detectors and so forth. So, and early vision systems use them. And then sometime later, I think it was his name Brenner in the UK, who got a Nobel Prize for C. elegans, which is this little tiny transparent worm. And I may again be remembering history very poorly, but as I recall, there's this thing called the planaria C. elegans, a little tiny flatworm or something that's sort of translucent or transparent, and I think he mapped the complete, what they call the neuron, the complete neural anatomy, the complete nervous system, which might be under 1,000 neurons. And that was a big deal, you know. The worm can't do much, but at least you knew whatever it did. So now, fast forward to today, and deep learning, of course, is the current super impressive, triumphant piece of artificial intelligence. And one of the 2 or 3 presenting great application areas is computer vision for deep learning. So the deep learning systems do phenomenally well, far beyond anything I could have imagined we'd be able to do 10 years ago or 20 years ago, far beyond. It's just astonishing. In fact, I just heard a talk just a few days ago by one of the founders of Siri, pointing out that this progress greatly exceeded his expectations too. So now let's think about this for a minute. So now we have these deep learning systems with terrific performance, whether it's, I don't know, whether it's for autonomous vehicles, whatever the exact application, fabulous real-world performance. They're massive. I don't know how many tens of millions of computing elements they have. You may call them neurons. They're little computing elements. They usually take an inner product and then have either some sort of saturation function, a hard or a sigmoid or something like that. They're connected. They have weights and so on and so forth. If you ask, what's the design of that system, we can tell you exactly the physical connections. Well, it's in virtual space because it's software, but we know exactly what the connectivity of that neural net is, that deep neural net. Maybe it's 8 or 10 or 15 levels deep. We know exactly what's connected to what. We know exactly what the weights are on every connection. We know exactly how it was trained. Maybe it was partially supervised and partially unsupervised. We know from an engineering perspective everything we could possibly want to know about that. And if I asked you, so how does it work?
Oh, right. No clue.
Why does it work so well? Not much of a theory.
Right.
So it's as though, if I go back to the Hubel and Wiesel, we're talking about 30, 40 more years ago, or the C. elegans, it's as though, well, we finally got our wish. We have the complete connectivity of the neural system. We know we have more than the connectivity. We know the weights and the computation. And we still don't have really a firm, clear understanding of why it works so well. Again, I'm not a specialist in that area anymore. My research career is kind of receding in the rearview mirror. But my impression is that we really don't have much of a theory as to why these fabulously effective, from a performance standpoint, why do they work so well? What exactly are they computing, and why is it so good?
Yeah, that is interesting. You have total knowledge of the whole current and past states of that system.
You know everything, and you know what's
unintelligible.
being, and partly if you go back, this is maybe a bit of a philosophical digression you may not want to entertain. So there's a long, well-established practice, philosophy, concept that says the way we understand complexity is by divide and conquer. If you want to build any complicated system, the first thing you have to decide is what are the cleavage points, what are the subsystems of that, whether it's software or hardware. Let's say software because that's intangible. harder to understand in some sense, and physical stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What are the components? How do you divide the components in ways that there's strong interactions within, but only minimal interactions between, well-defined minimal interactions between the components? How do you hierarchicalize it? How do you put them in layers? Who needs in the Computer History Museum to talk about layered software designs or objects or anything of that nature? They're all means of controlling complexity by breaking a very complicated solution, an engineered solution, the science of the artificial, into smaller and smaller pieces that can be understood, managed, created, debugged, and so on and so forth. And by the way, debugging, integration test is the hardest part of debugging because it's when you bring it all together. At least that's the way it used to be. All that practice, decades if not centuries of engineering practice of divide and conquer, make layers, separate things out, put things into smaller and smaller packages, is violated by deep learning networks. There is not much of that. And so we have one giant thing, hard to understand. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit because if you have receptive fields in computer vision applications, you can look at receptive fields. You can say they're this collection of computing elements, neurons, or whatever you want to call them. So we, to some extent, I'm overstating, I'm exaggerating a bit. But it's not like a system that was designed top-down where we did all the separation and all this layering so we could manage and understand complexity. So again, I'm just kind of an armchair philosopher on this at this point, but that's kind of my intuition about why it's hard to understand this stuff.
I think if my research serves me well, it was around 1976 that you and Richard Duda and Nils Nilsson began to explore using Bayesian statistical methods with inference systems for rule-based expert systems. And this, to me, seemed like a very significant development, both for you and for expert systems. So could you maybe describe, how you started to get into that area?
Sure, happy to. So there's a lot to the story, and we can make it as, okay. So it probably started a bit earlier than that. It might have been that the publications might have started, and I haven't looked it up, but 75 or whenever it was. Okay. But how we got into that. So we just were talking about the end of Shakey. Right. And Samuel Johnson or somebody or other supposedly said something to the effect that nothing concentrates the mind like the immediate prospect of hanging. And for a researcher, nothing concentrates the mind on writing proposals than the imminent end of a very large and long continuing research project and the end of funding. So as I pointed out a few minutes ago, that was clear that ARPA was not continuing with anything like a Shaky follow-on. So I was like, what do we do now? And so around that time, Ted Shortliff and Bruce Buchanan at Stanford had created this MySyn expert system, which was a rule-based expert system, the first ever rule-based expert system, in that case for diagnosing bacterial infections. And Ted was an MD or an MD student, and he probably wound up eventually with maybe both a PhD in computer science and an MD, I guess. Wonderful guy, very, 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 very bright and very lovely. And so we often went over to Stanford and listened to an occasional small research seminar, not a great big presentation, just a handful of people. I was very taken with that. So I started looking around, and I was always sort of an enterprising sort of person. Well, where should we apply this? And not medicine, because not only was we not MDs, but it was clear the medical establishment would take a very long time to accept any kind of computer, anything. Not that. Well, at that time, you may remember there was the oil crisis, the oil shock. In 1973
3, 4 was the first?
Something like that,
yeah.
And so, natural resources. And so, one thing about my sort of intellectual curiosity is that I've always been interested in what you might call the introductory course in anything and everything. I wasn't necessarily interested in the 5th such course, but I was always interested in what are the fundamentals, what are the basics, what's this stuff about, what are the open questions, what are the tools, just the introductory level. And so that made me a pretty well-suited character to explore new areas. And so I thought, well, natural resources. And so the first thing I thought about was hydrocarbons. It's a gas crunch, a petroleum crunch. Let's look at that. So what I'd found, didn't take all that much digging, was that the technology of hydrocarbon exploration was really very advanced and very sophisticated. Schlumberger, a name unfamiliar to most people because they make no consumer products, was and still is the giant. And there was very sophisticated instrumentation and, by the standards of the day, quite sophisticated software analysis. And I thought, I don't think we can add much there.
Now this is sort of the geophysical, seismological signal processing
all
stuff.
Of that, geochemical, seismic. Schlumberger puts instruments down boreholes and so forth. So in any case, the whole technology of oil exploration looked to me to be very sophisticated, very well staffed with very, very expert people. I didn't see that this new expert system concept would really find a very comfortable or productive home there. But right next door to oil hydrocarbon exploration was what we learned to call hard rock minerals. Okay. And hard rock minerals are things like copper, lead, zinc, uranium in those days, gold is fine, almost anything you can think of, tungsten, anything and everything that makes the modern world, other than aluminum, which is everywhere and just needs cheap power to refine, bauxite, and maybe iron ore, which is widespread. So other than those, practically every mineral every metal that's used to create the modern world is what's called a hard rock mineral. And it is true that the hard rock mineral industry is just a small fraction of the size of the hydrocarbon industry. It was plenty big enough. Moreover, my impression was that at the level of technological sophistication, particularly on the computing side, was very, very limited, very basic, very elementary, certainly compared to the hydrocarbon world, which is quite the contrary. And I thought we could really make a contribution there. So I dug in pretty deep and secured funding initially from the U.S. Geological Survey, which conveniently had its Western Regional Office sharing a back fence with SRI, although I did have to trek to the Reston, Virginia, where the headquarters is, near Dulles Airport, quite a lot, and some National Science Foundation and a little bit of other funding. And Dick Duda and I, and to some extent Nils Nilsson and a couple of other people, started this project we called PROSPECTOR. And there's really some funny things about the technology. It looks pretty simple by today's standards, but some funny little quirks with the technology thing. So I thought we'd do something like MySyn, but just apply it in this new world. And we'd make some improvements that I'll get to in a minute that you brought up. But the first thing was that, of course, I misunderstood exactly how MySyn worked. Because again, I liked the first course and everything, and I'm always moving too fast, and I go through a lot of stuff, but things fall in the cracks too, there's a penalty. So I didn't quite understand exactly how MySyn worked, and in particular, I misunderstood the control structure. And I didn't appreciate that Meison's control structure was nothing other than the Lisp pushdown stack. And so instead what I did was create an explicit network to connect these rules, which Meison never had. And so once you have an explicit network, you can create whatever control regime you want to, how to explore that. What do you do next? What question do you ask next? How do you propagate, and so on and so forth. So the first thing I did was, in misunderstanding Meison, I created what I think is probably a better conceptual structure, because again, an explicit network really allows you to do a lot more.
May I ask a question about that to make sure I'm following what an explicit network actually is? In a rule-based system, I understand the rules are most often expressed as if-then statements.
Right.
For the most part. Now is the network then a network of these if-then statements?
Exactly.
Would
That's all it
be
is.
to say the edges of that graph are dependencies, or?
No, you're exactly right, David. There's a node which is a rule, and it says if this and this and this and this, and that's the inputs, then this is the conclusion. And you get the conclusion in that parent node. Okay. And so you just connect those together. So it's exactly the same. If you were doing this from a knowledge engineering standpoint, you might be trying to elicit if-then rules, except I just wrote them down explicitly in a network because I thought that's what Ted had done.
Okay.
I believe he didn't, or at least not in the very first incarnation. There must have been 10 or more PhD theses from that eventually. But right. In any case, so we have this explicit network. The other thing I did different was that I didn't really like the certainty factors that Ted used. They were serviceable, but they were just an ad hoc weighting scheme because we all appreciate that these decision problems involve uncertain or inexact reasoning, so you cannot just use Boolean logic exclusively. Right. You had to have some sort of weights or soft or fuzzy reasoning or something. And of course, Latviazadeh at that point had gotten fuzzy logic on the map, and I knew Latvi very well and understood it and decided, no, I didn't really want to do that. But I was sort of an unreconstructed Bayesian, and in fact, my PhD dissertation at that point, not too many years previously, was on non-parametric decision theory, so it was like a big superset of Bayesian stuff. And Dick and I decided that, Dick Duda and I decided that Bayesian inference was the way to go. And so we created a very formal structure of Bayesian inference and used those kinds of computations explicitly mapped onto this network, and that's the way PROSPECTOR worked.
How would you describe, or could you describe Bayesian inference in, the most accessible way for somebody reading this or writing this? How should we understand what Bayesian inference is?
That's an interesting challenge. I've never tried to explain this really simply. But a key concept in Bayesian reasoning is that if you're trying to sort out which of a couple of hypotheses is true, in the simplest case, it's, the yes, no, A, B, right. Binary decisions. Mm-hmm. It's important to take into consideration the prior likelihood of each of those two situations, prior meaning before you've gotten any evidence about this particular case. And a good friend of mine teaches, is a Stanford professor in the medical school who teaches diagnosis to medical students. And he tells me on our bike rides, do I know about Bayesian reasoning, the importance of priors? And I say, well, as a matter of fact, I do. And he says, well, that's what I teach the medical students. So I'm also a birder and a bird photographer. And the joke among birders, you're wondering, what's that bird that you can't see but you can hear? You think something, but you can't see it, and it can be confused. The joke is, if you hear if you hear hoofbeats just over the hill, and you're wondering, is it horses or unicorns? I can't really see anything. Go with the horses.
Yeah. Okay.
So the idea is that some things, is it a common cold or is it an obscure tropical disease? and the person hasn't been, those priors are very important. And so it's not that they cannot be overcome by sufficiently strong evidence, but you cannot treat the world as having all hypotheses or all possible classifications as equally likely if they're not. So Bayesian reasoning is a formal theoretical structure, quantitative. It's very simple formulas, very simple elementary formula manipulation for representing the fact that different outcomes or different classifications, like disease, have different initial or prior probabilities, and you have to include that when you compute or personally estimate what's called the posterior probabilities, which posterior means after you've observed the evidence for this case. Now we're down to specifics. We're not talking about all possible people and all possible diseases. We're talking about you and your case and your lab results, diagnostic findings, and so on and so forth. So you have to be able to combine those two. Otherwise, you're really missing the boat, and you will misdiagnose a lot of things. So Bayesian reasoning is a way of doing that. Bayesian inference is a way of doing that. And a good friend of mine at the time, a professional friend of mine, was Yehuda Pearl, who was a professor at UCLA, computer science, and we see each other at conferences all the time and sing folk songs together and whatnot after hours. And Yehuda really picked up on that, much to his credit, and wrote a textbook about Bayesian reasoning, and Dick Duda and I were just interested in make PROSPECTOR work. And that really became a very important theme in artificial intelligence. Yehuda, as you of course know, became a Computer History Museum Fellow on the strength of that. I presume that was the main contribution. He really
focused.
Told me in so many words that he had picked it up because he saw that the stuff that Dick Duda and I had done was really could be taken much further than Dick and I were interested in doing it. Yehuda was a professor at UCLA. Dick and I were building systems.
And it is my understanding that he also, as he got into the Bayesian inference world, that he was also exploring it in the context of rule-based expert systems.
I suppose. I don't really remember the history well enough to speak to that. But I do think it's the case that for quite a few years, maybe still today, Bayesian inference has been a pretty important thread in what's nowadays called GOFI, good old-fashioned AI, to distinguish it from neural nets, which don't have anything at all really, or not much to do with that. But to get back to PROSPECTOR, because that was the system that we eventually built, I'll mention two or three things that might be of interest. When Dick Duda and I gave our very first public presentation on that, it was in if my memory serves, it was in a kind of specialized systems conference in Hawaii in 1974 or something, whatever it was. You will have to look it up. And one of the attendees was Doug Lynott, who Doug is a wonderful person who, for the last 30 years or more, had been working on a system called Psych, but at that point was maybe still even a graduate student or not much beyond. Very, very lovely guy and very, very smart, incisive, insightful kind of person. And he wrote did a write-up in some little, maybe AI little newsletter or something. He did a little write-up review of this conference, and I still remember, even though it was 40 or more years ago, he mentioned PROSPECTOR, and he said, "This is the one to watch." And I happened to see Doug here at the Computer History Museum a couple of months ago or so at an event here, and we were chatting, glad to see each other, hadn't caught up for quite a while. And the event was about expert systems, so this topic came up, and I said, "Doug, I still remember You wrote this. We loved you. Dick Dude and I loved you. I remember reading this, and I remember running into Dick's office, and I said, Dick, look what Doug wrote about us. So we got a kick out of that, and of course Doug remembered it because he's a smart guy. So PROSPECTOR really was pretty important. I'm going to go on and follow that because I'm going to tie up some earlier, kind of following some earlier comments. I mentioned that one of the unique contributions of PROSPECTOR at the time was the explicit inference network, as we called it, that there was this explicit connection of all the rules. Okay. And that allowed you to have different control regimes for how do you use these things? How do you compute? What do you compute next? And that led to a very important, initially totally unpredicted advance, which was that we had a wonderful, initially he might have been a student, wonderful researcher working with us named Kurt Connelidge. And Kurt later went on to great fame as a roboticist, another brilliant, brilliant guy. But at that time he was, quote, just a programmer. Much more than that. And he said to Dick and me, he said, you know, we can compile the inference nets. So if you put all the data in at once at the tip nodes, as opposed to asking questions, you know, with our control structure, we say, what's the next question to ask? Forget that. We put all the possible data in and just do a forward propagation, compute everything, and we'll get an answer. Totally unexpected initially, because we had this explicit network structure I mentioned. Unexpected benefit. That's just the beginning of the story. So then we said, well, we can compute stuff really fast now. Where do we get a ton of data? As opposed to asking an explorationist one question at a time painfully. And the answer is geological maps. That was the next breakthrough. Because geologists, most fundamental tool is mapping. All geologists learned that. The specialty of geology having to do with mineral exploration has this odd name of economic geology. Economic geology is founded on maps, so you have a map laid out, and it has the geological data, which might be the major kinds of geological structures or faults or sedimentary layers or what have you. It has all the geophysical data, if you've done any kind of aerial soundings or something like that, or gravimetric or something like that. There's all the geochemical data. The joke is you take graduate students and they call them mud scoopers. They walk up the stream scooping mud and saving it every 100 yards, and you do an analysis of that. So you overlay all the geochemical, geophysical, and geological data on a map. And now we can imagine putting a little grid on that map at some resolution, of course laughably small by today's standards because of computation, but good enough. And for each point on the grid, you have all of this data kind of going down, the geology, the geochemistry, and the geophysics. And now you can make a PROSPECTOR model, and that's the way we organize the knowledge base, was having what are called models of ore deposits, which the best economic geologists spend their careers formulating. So we have the model for a particular kind of deposit. Let's say we're looking for a particular kind of molybdenum deposits. They classify these things. Mississippi Valley type lead zinc deposit, massive sulfide deposits. That's what the economic geologists do. So let's say we're wondering, do we have a molybdenum? We have a molybdenum model, and we're looking at an area under exploration. And we have this map that has all this data that I mentioned. And we have a compiled knowledge base, which means for every point on the map, we can forward chain. We could do a forward propagation through the knowledge base and come up with a favorability index using the Bayesian reasoning we were describing, Bayesian inference we were describing. For each point on the map, we can compute a favorability score of how likely is it that there's a, let's say in this case, molybdenum ore at that point in the map.
Wow. Okay, let me see if I'm following that. So is it that, so you have a set of data for each point, and then you are able to take that set of data and sort of ask the knowledge base which of these rules speaks to this data?
No, we use all the rules. We use all the rules. Think of it as being a bunch of tip nodes. That's where data goes in.
Okay.
And a network that propagates forward or upwards, those are the rules which are typically layered, because when we build a knowledge base, we try to think of it the way the geologist thinks of it, which they think of the geological structure, the tectonic setting, the mineralization, and so forth. So there's sections of the knowledge base. It's not like the deep learning thing. We've built it. We know the subcomponents. All this data from the bottom regarding this one little map cell gets fed forward through our compiled network. All the Bayesian inference computations get performed. And out of the top comes a favorability rating. How likely is it that all the data that you've got for this one little map cell, the map cell, is where you're going to find molybdenum? And so you do that over the entire prospect, as the geologists call it, the area that's thought to be maybe there's something valuable down below. So we have this explicit network. I'm kind of recapping. We have this explicit network, which I mentioned earlier, had real value. We can very rapidly compute everything through it. We're not stopping asking question 1, question 2, question 3. We're taking all the data from that map cell, computing everything at once, then go on to the next map cell. And we can output a favorability map that says this is how it is. Now, mineral exploration is extraordinarily difficult. Most economic geologists never find a mineable deposit in their entire career. The expression in the industry is you have to look at 1,000 prospects to find one mineable deposit. Each stage of exploration is 10 or 100 times more expensive than the previous one. Surface walking, mapping the surface, eventually diamond drilling in some remote area. None of these things is next to a freeway. Put a diamond drill rig in the field 100 miles from the nearest train or road or something. Hugely expensive. So you've got to go through what AI people call a progressive deepening strategy, which is kind of funny in the context of geology, and get as much information as you can at that level of expense, and then decide to proceed or to cut your losses. So here's the big result of all this. This has been a lot of explanation about how does this stuff work and so forth. It's very difficult to get actual field data from the mining industry because it's famously secretive. Because if your competitor thinks that this is a valuable place, they'll try to buy up the mining rights before you get there. So it's very secretive. However, because we were able to work with really the best known exploration geologists or economic geologists in North America and in some other parts of the world as well, like Australia. Some of the best, in fact, Canada, I would say the best economic geologists in the English-speaking world. We had Americans, Canadians, and Australians on our expert contributor team. We were astonishingly able to get data from a molybdenum deposit in, I think it was Idaho. And one of my key collaborators and lifelong friend, Alan Campbell, then a graduate student, long since Dr. Alan Campbell, is a Canadian economic geologist whose father was also a famous economic geologist. And through Alan Campbell, we were able to get access to typically highly secret commercial data about a particular prospect in, I think it was Idaho, called Mount Tolman, T-O-L-M-A-N, the Mount Tolman deposit. Eventually, that deposit was exploited by a mining company. It was mined. There's a big open pit, and absolutely everything is known about the geology of that deposit because it's now been mined for a long time. But through Al Campbell, we were able to get the initial exploration data from the company before any of the actual diamond drilling was done, which in turn, that's to bring up cores for analysis, which in turn was before an open pit mine exists. So this is like, take yourself back to the time when you were just a surface geologist getting some level of relatively inexpensive geological, geochemical perhaps data and so forth. So we had that data set. We went through exactly the process I've described, and we produced a favorability map, which was just color-coded. Red was hot, you know, dark was cold, yellow's just what you would have done.
Right.
And compared that with the known deposit as revealed by many, many years of actual open pit mining. And when you placed one over the other, the congruence was so exact, you would have sworn that we dry labbed it if you didn't know better. Down to the point that there was actually two lobes or two parts of the ore body, a big one and a little one, and a strip in between they call the barren zone. And our favorability map exactly reproduced that. You looked at the red, the bright red, orange, whatever, hot spots. There was a little one there and a big one there. It was so, as I say, it was almost too good to believe. It was that accurate. So we published that as a short item in Science magazine. We published longer descriptions in the more narrowly, you know, AI-ish technical literature.
Right.
We published a short account of that with the maps in Science magazine. And I'm pretty certain that's what ignited the boom in expert systems. The magazine, the Science magazine article was immediately taken up by a wide spread of media. You know how that process works because you're a professional. It usually got headlined as "Prospector discovers a mine" or "Artificial intelligence discovers a mine."
Right.
Of course, that's not strictly accurate because by the time we were there was a mine.
Right.
But the spirit was correct. We used the preliminary data long before there was an open pit. We correctly predicted exactly where the richest ore bodies would be. It was mineable. That's kind of the economic definition of an ore body. You can mine it at a profit.
Right.
And that got from the little more specialized magazines to the, you know, to, I forget, Newsweek or Fortune or Business Week or everywhere. We started acquiring a set of clippings like that from the more popular press. And that really is what got things launched. At that time, I was thinking maybe I should be looking beyond my career at Stanford Research Institute, or then SRI International. The name had changed by then. I was had been the director of the Artificial Intelligence Center for some years, and so I was starting to look for what am I going to do next, perhaps someplace else, and the field of expert system just exploded.
Two quick questions before we continue to follow that line. How did you get access to these experts in economic geology in the English-speaking world?
It was a struggle. My first expert was Professor Charles PARC, who was the dean of the School of Earth Science at Stanford and the legendary dean of economic geology in the English-speaking world. I did my first knowledge engineering with him, and he was helpful. But I recognized that I had somehow not structured it right because there was like almost flat, almost like checklist style. And I realized I somehow wasn't getting the right structure. So I didn't know enough to ask him the right questions because he knew everything there was to know about that field. Then through another professor there, I met Al Campbell. There's a professor there who was really more on the hydrocarbon side, but he said, oh, I've got a graduate student. And Al Campbell came ambling into the room. He's like 6'5" in a plaid shirt. He was born in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories in a mining camp. He's just wonderful. He's a lifelong friend. We were still very close friends. Al immediately jumped into this because he was interested in the, he had a somewhat unusual thesis that connected pure economic geology with decision-making mechanisms. How do you make decisions, and what's the theory behind that? And so he's perfect. And he also, so we built another model with him, and that had a little better structure, a little more generalizable, a little more structure to it. And then through him, I met Marco Einaudi, and Marco also became a lifelong friend, wonderful person who was a professor of economic geology at Stanford. I think he became head of the department at one point. Now I guess emeritus. And with Marco's help, Marco had been a practicing field economic geologist for mining companies before he became an academic. And with Marco, we had step one with Charles PARC, step two, a better model, structurally a better model with Al Campbell. And with Marco, we really struck pay dirt, to pursue the analogy. And he figured out how to structure these knowledge-based models, these ore deposit models, in a way that exactly mirrored the way the geologists think about it. There's sections of what's the tectonic setting, what's the regional setting, what's the local geology, what are the alteration and mineralization products that you could observe, and just the way a very sophisticated, intellectually deep, thoughtful geologist would structure these. And I think Marco's in the middle of writing like a definitive work on this. And so Dick Duda and I said, this is fabulous. Not only does it allow us to get into tremendous depth and specialization about the questions and the nuggets and the modules of the knowledge base, but it's also generalizable. Marco was an expert in a particular kind of copper deposits called porphyry copper. Very economically very important set of copper ore deposits. Same approach can be used for anything for which the geologists think they have a model. And that just it almost became cookie cutter after that. So we already had Charles PARC, the most famous economic geologist probably in North America at least, and Marco Einaudi, who at that point was a professor. We had Al Campbell, whose father, Neil Campbell, was credited with two major discoveries. I told you most economic geologists never have one in their entire career. I mean, this was the all-star team. So then we started getting some of the best economic geologists in Canada. We got the most famous economic geologist in Australia who had done work in diamond deposits in South Africa and what's called spinifex, which is kind of a texture of rock stuff. Dick Duda and I put on a fabulous show. After we got our first real models working, we set up something at SRI, and I can't tell you how difficult it was to get 20 displays hooked together to show the same thing from a time-shared computer in 1975 or whenever it was. This was just setting these demos up were super challenging, just getting stuff wired. And we invited the leading English-speaking exploration geologists, and we just had 25 or 30 people there. They typically had titles like VP of Exploration for Anaconda or something like that. And we showed them our stuff, and I mean, it was jaw-dropping. It was like, can computers do that? It was fabulous. So then we set up a little bit extra funding program they could contribute to, and that sort of thing. So it was really a very big deal, and you have to remember this was all in the second half of the 70s. There wasn't much. Right. So we were very, very early.
So I was just making the point that with all this interest in your wonderful demo, you would think that it would seem to me that there was the possibility for doing a large project to make PROSPECTOR version 2 or
right.
extend it
right.
at SRI International. But and all this public attention, but is this the same time period when the whole machine intelligence corporation story begins?
No. That's
Okay.
different. That's different. Well, a bit overlapping, so I can sort of sort that out.
Thank you.
So Machine Intelligence Corporation was a Charlie Rosen brainstorm. And I don't remember the exact founding date. Would it have been 76, or were you able to look that up? Or did I look it up?
I have 78 written down.
Maybe
but
78.
I could be wrong.
Well, I don't recall, but it was well before 1980. I left SRI at 1980. And Machine Intelligence Corp was started with the breathtakingly naive business plan that it would be an AI company whose mission it was to start more AI companies. So, I mean, you know, you think about focus, 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 and it seemed that it was just unbelievable that we thought to do that. But the idea is we do a vision company, an expert system company. Gary Hendricks, another wonderful, very smart guy, was doing natural language interfaces to databases, natural language query to databases. So we would start this Machine Intelligence Corp, and Machine Intelligence Corp would start all these separate companies. And so Charlie became the first employee, and Earl Satcher-Dotty, who was the next generation of brilliant young researcher, became maybe the second or third employee. I was a co-founder. I think Dick Duda was probably a co-founder. If I recall, I definitely was. And we elected never to become employees. So we never went there. And then Machine Intelligence Corp spun off to its own fate, and that's another long story. But by the late 1970s, PROSPECTOR was mainly funded by the U.S. Geological Survey, and their motivation was that they have a mission, at least at the time, to assess what's called the mineral endowment of public lands. And the concept is that you need to know, if you're the government, you need to know something about what the likely mineral resources are when you make decisions about, for example, setting vast tracts of land aside as no-go areas by whatever of several mechanisms, obviously, national monuments or so on and so forth, or maybe what to charge for leases or what have you. And it's a very narrow line they walk, in a sense, because they're supposed to get this broad-scale endowment figure, I mean, like all of Alaska. But they're not supposed to actually find a mine, because that's the mining company's job. So they want the best information they could get, but not too localized or too precise, because then the government's not supposed to know, drill here, or, you know. So they had this kind of broad scale thing, but that was never really my concern. I was just dimly aware of that as kind of a backdrop. Right. So long after I left PROSPECTOR, and actually after I left SRI, I think there was some continuing work on this mineral endowment kind of thing, or other kind of larger scale. So I lost visibility. But to your question about couldn't we get research funding, at that point, all of our attention was on the private sector. This was the hothouse boom. AI was going to finally do something. Expert systems was the vehicle for that, was it. What do you want to do? And so I thought about starting a company to pursue something or other, but I really thought that I wasn't interested in the tool business. At that point, Ed Feigenbaum and Bruce Buchanan and others at Stanford had probably dozens of graduate students who had worked on extensions of Mycin in one sort or another. And they had formed, I guess it was initially Technology. Right. And that was the first of quite a large number of so-called expert system tool companies. I don't think many of them did very well eventually, by making what originally called an e-Mycin, the idea being an empty Mycin, just the software framework, but not the rules for medicine, so go apply it to something else. Right. So I chose not to do that, and instead, through sort of a series of interactions, I got connected with Schlumberger. And that's the beginning of a new chapter, if you want to go there now.
That would be wonderful.
So Schlumberger, I mentioned briefly before, is not widely known to the general public because it makes no consumer products or services. But I guess it still is, though I haven't followed it. At the time, it was fabulously profitable. It was one of the 5 or 6 biggest market cap companies on the New York Stock Exchange, even though the revenue was not nearly the same level as the other gigantic cap companies like the oil companies. The reason Schlumberger's market capitalization was so enormous is because it was fabulously profitable. And it was run at the time by a business legend named Jean Riboud. And to call Jean Riboud the Louis XIV of Schlumberger is not to give him enough credit or to say enough. He was brilliant, and he had orchestrated this growth of a company over several decades from a family business run by 2 brothers, the Schlumberger brothers, that dated back to the late 1920s, I think, to this fabulously successful worldwide thing. And in recent years, they had moved away from the oil field services, which was the birth and profit driver of the company, to various kinds of electronics and computing companies. They had a separate half of their business or side of their business. And around that time, Jean Riboud proclaimed that AI was the new oil. And he went on record of that. By the way, if you want to learn about Riboud, there was a 2 or 3 part personality profile in the New Yorker about him back at that time in the late 70s or something like that. You can look that up, I think. Anchetta was the author or something. Anyway, so he said AI was a new oil. And I had approached Schlumberger somehow or other. I guess they put on a huge extravaganza AI meeting and recruited AI big names, so to speak, to come. And they had a big tent in their gorgeous laboratory in Ridgefield, Connecticut. It's like sort of like a PARC, but fancier with a French chef.
Were they, now, it's a French company, but they had a headquarters but they're on the New York Stock Exchange.
It's a unique company.
Break it down for me?
Yeah, I mean, again, I haven't followed it for a long
At this time.
But back in the day, it was a French-American company. They had dual world headquarters in Paris and in Park Avenue in Manhattan at that time.
Okay.
They were a phenomenally decentralized company. Their headquarters staff was probably a few hundred combined. Compare that with any other company of that scale. Maybe it's only a couple hundred total. They regarded themselves as the world's only international company as opposed to multinational company. They said multinational or domestic companies with foreign operations. They were international. And so, for example, the person at the time who ran, I think, the Mideast was Scots or something like that, and the person who ran the Western Hemisphere was German, or I mean, something or other like that. It was, the language of the company was English, the business language. All the senior executives had probably lived in 10 different countries by the time they were, 40 or something like that. It was a phenomenal company, just phenomenal company. And so they put on this extravaganza, as I recall, with literally circus tent scale stuff on the grounds of their just gorgeous research facility in Ridgefield, Connecticut. As I said, it was sort of like Xerox PARC, but nicer. Maybe not quite as big, but fancier. And there was 2 days or something, paid us something or other to go there, and 2 days of discussions about AI and where's it going. So I tried to, after that, to convince Schlumberger to fund me in some new venture. I didn't even know what the hell it was going to be, but they were better negotiators, and they persuaded me to start the world's first artificial intelligence center in a commercial corporation, which I did. And so the guy I was dealing with was a phenomenal guy named Tom Roberts, who later became both famous and infamous in the Valley. But Tom was like a 38-year-old CFO of this phenomenal company who was actually a West Pointer who had come up with blood and guts secret missions in the Mideast or something like that and had survived all sorts of firefights. And Tom was a very remarkable guy, but I don't know what became of him. In any case, he definitely out-negotiated me. And he said, well, he said, Peter said, you have the reputation of being probably the only sane person in artificial intelligence. I don't know where that came from, but remember the comment. So he said, write me a memo about 3 locations in the country where we might set up an artificial intelligence center. I said, I'd be happy to, Tom, but the only place I'm going to do it is right around here. So if you want me to do it, it'll be around here. But I'd be happy to write you the memo. So I set up an artificial intelligence center in the original Fairchild building on Miranda Avenue in Palo Alto, which is kind of a frontage road to Foothill Expressway and adjacent to Penn High.
4001 Miranda Avenue?
Yeah, I think that's it, yeah.
That's Gordon Moore's old R&D lab?
Yep. And
was the building still there?
The building was there.
So it was in that building?
It was in that building.
Whoa.
It was an R&D lab, but of course it was a semiconductor R&D lab, and here I was a fish out of water. But we recruited some of the best people I thought some of the best people in the country. 3 or 4 colleagues from SRI came over with me, including Dick Duda, Marty Tenenbaum, and Harry Barrow, another wonderful researcher who eventually returned to England, his home country. And recruited wonderful people like Dick Lyon, for example. I mean, just fabulous staff. And there we were, creating the new oil.
A couple questions about that.
Yeah.
At this time, Schlumberger had bought Fairchild's semiconductor operation from
the company. It had bought the company. And Tom Roberts
was the whole Fairchild
thing.
Camera and Instrument, including the electronics.
No, Fairchild Semiconductor, which is a different company.
Yeah, okay.
It had bought Fairchild Semiconductor. Tom Roberts had engineered the purchase. He came out to run it. Schlumberger has done numerous acquisitions, and the way they do it is they bring only 3 people: a CEO, a CFO, and can you guess the third person? The head of HR. And with those 3, they can control the company.
And keep everybody else.
Keep everybody else.
So was that, so Schlumberger had already, through that acquisition, had that building where you built your lab?
The timing was very funny.
Oh.
I was chatting with Tom about this and going through this negotiation, and then I pick up the San Jose Mercury one day and it says, Schlumberger is acquiring Fairchild. And and the next thing I find out, Tom Roberts is coming out to run it. It's like, oh. It was like just
independent strands.
Yeah. Well, Tom no doubt knew what was happening,
Sure.
but I didn't. So in any case, we did the deal, and Tom became a little bit infamous because he made comments to the the executive staff, or the top management staff at Fairchild that gained currency and weren't highly flattering. So he became a little bit,
critical of the previous management.
Well, there was a famous quote. He said something like, now I should be careful because this is going to be on your camera. Maybe I better not give.
Okay. But it offended people.
It offended people a bit. But Schlumberger poured unlimited money, and they created a new fab up in Washington State and some location there. But after about 2.5 years or so, I had understood a lot about what Schlumberger was about and how it worked, and I decided this is not my future. So, a fabulous company in many respects. Their HR practices, I still remember their HR practices. One performance evaluation form for pretty much every professional in the company around the world on one page. And if I recall, and I remember one of the questions that was great, it says, well, 2 questions. One question was, can this person be promoted 2 levels at once? In other words, it's the fast track potential person. And another question was, to what extent is this person respected? And then it said on the form, not liked, respected. Interesting insights. I probably am revealing a trade secret that I swore not to, but they can do what they want. In any case, I concluded that my bliss did not lie there and I should seek excellence elsewhere. And at that time, Dick Duda and I decided we were starting a new company. And a good long-term friend of mine, Steve Weil, spelled W-E-Y-L, Steve Weil, who I had known since he was 16 and a half years old, when he had already finished a year of college and was working for me as a kind of an intern. Steve was a prodigy, brilliant. And at that point, he had gotten a Stanford Master's in Computer Science and a Harvard MBA. And we decided we're going to start this new company. And then in the process, we learned that another guy named Sheldon Briner was going to think about starting a company in the same area. He was a kind of a local entrepreneur. And so we combined forces and we started Syntelligence. And I said goodbye to Schlumberger. I thanked them. Thought it was a great experience. I loved it, but I was going to be off to doing this new stuff.
Before we dig into Syntelligence, I wanted to ask you about Schlumberger's ambitions for your operation. Was it the case that, was it a blend of two things? One, AI is the new oil, so drill for new AI and we'll sell it. But was it also artificial intelligence in service of Schlumberger's other existing businesses in electronics, in computing, in prospecting, in oil stuff?
No, Schlumberger, I think, had a brilliant top management. And they approached this exactly the way I would have if I had been smart enough and thought about it and were in their position. It was a little bit of a takeoff of the famous Supreme Court comment about pornography. Remember that famous one?
I know it when I see it.
I'll know it when I see it. And the way it was put to me in so many words, Riboud had a wonderful kind of a right-hand technical man named Jean Babot, who I think he had acquired Jean Babot's company. And Babot was a vice president level, and he kind of circled the world talking to people like me within the Schlumberger world and figuring out how to make connections. And the message was really clear. Peter, we'll give you 2 or 3 years, and then we'll see if anybody cares. Anybody in Schlumberger cares. So it's up to me, and they supported us very well, and people like Jean Babot would make any kind of connections that we needed, because nobody in Fairchild, other than 3 people, knew anything about Schlumberger. Nobody around my managerial environment could help, with the possible exception of those 3 individuals. Right. Lots of support. Do something that makes anybody in Schlumberger care about what you're doing. And what I taught people, because I've always mentored people my whole career, in fact, I still mentor a lot of people nowadays, is that that's the best deal you can get as a research manager, as a research leader. If you don't like that, I recommend you seek excellence elsewhere. Because it's like, don't tell me what you want, I'm going to tell you what you need. And it's up to me to figure that out. I've got to figure out what you need that I can provide, and then I've got to create the programs and the deliverables to do that. So I think that's a terrific deal. You have tremendous autonomy, a huge amount of rope. Just don't hang yourself with it. And so that's exactly what I did, and I thought that was terrific. I was also just high enough, so I had a lot of visibility into the top level, beginning with Riboud. I remember having dinner with him, small group dinner, and I happened to be seated by him. And I asked him, Mr. Riboud, how do you decide how to buy a company? Because he had done so many acquisitions, big and small. I said, the company is so complicated. There's so many moving parts, I said, if it were like a sofa, it would be easy. And he says to me, oh, he said, you do the same thing you do for a sofa. What's that? He said, ask your wife. So I had a lot of visibility there, and once every 5 years, Schlumberger did a worldwide offsite for their top executives somewhere in the world. And it happened that one of them was coming up when I was there, and I got invited. So my wife and I went there. The women were told to stay in Paris until, the end of the work session, and then We went off to Deauville, and where the meeting was. Tom Roberts used to say that Rabu always picked great places, but always the wrong time of year. Who wants to go to Deauville in the winter or something? Normandy coast or something. Anyway, so that was basically the deal. Do something that somebody will care about. And I can define it up front. We'll know when we see it. So I thought that was just a brilliant strategy, brilliant marching orders, perfect charter or mission for a new research center, and I was happy to sign up. But after a few years, I decided, you know, I can see this will be a long slog. What's the upside? What are the constraints? I'll have to move. Everybody in Schlumberger moves all the time. I'm not going to move. And so Dick and I decided to start a new company, which we did.
So it was less about support or culture and more just for you, your interests and seeing other opportunity.
Yeah. Oh, we were very well supported. It was terrific.
Okay.
But I you know, at that point I would have been about what would I have been by then? I would have been early 40s, 41, 42. And the question was, did I really want to have an extended stay of my career there? Mm-hmm. What Charlie used to teach us was, and this is good advice that I've repeated, but of course I don't usually give him any credit for it with that attribution, is that people and plans both benefit by being repotted every 5 years or so. And it doesn't have to be exactly 5. It could be 3, it could be 7. But think in those terms. Think about your career in 5-year chunks. And when I think about my long career, that's pretty much the way it worked out. You don't have to necessarily change your employer, but you have to change your mission, your work situation, your job responsibilities. So for example, at SRI, I was in really 3 different kinds of responsibilities in 15 years. It worked out just about like that.
Right.
So anyway, you know, I had internalized that by then, and I thought, do I want this to be my 5-year stint? And I thought, well, yeah, but no more than that. It's coming up on 3. And again, there was so much ferment about commercial applications of AI, so I decided, yeah, I want to go do that.
So the discussions that lead to the formation of Syntelligence begin when?
No later than 82.
Which is really interesting because Syntelligence from the beginning is going to be aimed toward finance, correct?
Sort of, yes. With 2 caveats or 2 additional comments. First, we were determined that it would not be an expert system tool company or programming shell company, as I discussed before, which set it apart from every single other expert system company that we were aware of, and there were at least 2 different newsletters about expert systems then. In fact, one of the newsletter writers was here at your event a couple of months ago.
Collected his newsletters for the collection.
Yeah, it was Paul Armour, was that it?
Yes.
If I remember, I think that's, yeah. So we were not going to become a tool company. And the second is, finance is a big world. And so how do we figure out which piece we should go after? So Steve Weil, as I mentioned, Steve and I really, Sheldon Briner was the money raiser, but Steve and I think were really the operational heart and soul of that company at the outset. And Dick Duda was the technical genius. I mean, I still remembered a thing or 2 technically. I hadn't totally lost my chops, but Dick was still strictly technical. So Steve Weil and I started going around to all the various different financial institutions, some in San Francisco, but mostly in New York. We visited stockbrokers, we visited fund managers, we visited commodity traders, foreign exchange traders. We visited somebody in San Francisco whose business was to evaluate money managers for pension funds. If you're an institutional investor, like a pension fund, 100 people are pitching you, how do you evaluate them? This guy was really at the meta level. His job was to evaluate other people whose job it was to invest money. So we really looked very widely. Some people were fabulously successful. We visited somebody in a Park Avenue duplex who literally had a woman in a French maid's costume, answer the door by the time you went up their private elevator to the penthouse, literally in a costume.
Yeah.
So here's one thing that Steve and I learned. Everybody in that financial sector has an incredibly compelling story to tell you about why the stuff that they're doing and the way they're doing it is brilliant, effective, and is bound to bring unbounded returns, to quote Gilbert and Sullivan. And Steve and I quickly figured out that the reason is that anybody who does not have such a compelling story quickly gets weeded out. But it doesn't mean they have reproducible expertise. This is expert systems, right? Mm-hmm. So we went through a lot of stuff, a ton of stuff. I remember going to the senior vice president of underwriting at Allstate, just outside of Chicago, and him saying to me, you know, Peter, he said, once you've seen 40 million drivers, you've pretty much seen them all. So again, my predilection for liking the first course in practically every subject really stood me in very good stead, because I could pretty quickly go through the first course, the first learning experiences, the first few learning experiences, and all of these subspecialties in the huge financial sector. And what I came up with, and Steve supported, Steve seconded it, was two closely related areas, not directly related financially, but technically we thought virtually identical, and proved to be. They were both underwriting tasks. Underwriting is a financial term that means risk assessment. And it comes, I think, historically from the idea that to underwrite means to sign your name below.
Oh, right.
Here's the contract.
Literally underwriting.
Literally, I am signing my name to the bottom. I think that's the origin, perhaps. But in any case, it's risk assessment. And we concluded that both in the insurance sector and in the bank lending sector, you both are underwriting financial risk. You're assessing financial risk. And in both of those, we could have done either, but we wound up doing both because they seem so similar. In both, we decided that the very high end of the market was not where the sweet spot was. Because, for example, if IBM gets insurance of any kind, it's not remotely a risk assessment. It's a financial engineering transaction. IBM will pay its losses. The insurance company will not. They will self-insure because they're so huge. But the management of that and how they finance that, that's complicated. So they may get, at least that was my understanding. It's not risk assessment. At the bottom of the market, it's, you know, once you've seen 40 million drivers, you've seen them all. It's rate and weight. It's a half a dozen factors or a dozen factors. It's a purely statistical thing. They've been doing it for decades. It's satisfactory. There's no upside. There's no headroom.
Right.
But in the vast, what are called the middle market, that's a different story. It's not the high end. It's not the consumer level, the retail level. So, for example, it might be how this museum gets insured. It might be a strip mall. It might be a bowling alley. It might be a privately owned company, a machinist company that maybe have 50 people in it. Or it might be a middle market retailer or a distributor that has 100 or 300 people and a fleet of trucks or something like that. They may have revenues in the tens of millions or maybe the hundreds of millions, but not the billions. And the same thing's true on the lending side, or the borrowing side. And so now it's back to my Jean Rebout comment, which is why I mentioned it. How do you evaluate a company? They're complicated. There's lots of moving parts, even a relatively small company. It doesn't have to be IBM or Google.
Right.
So there they rely on human underwriters. They are risk assessors. It's very experience-based. There's some amount of financial analysis, and there are, of course, computational tools for doing financial analysis. But it's largely human judgment. As I say, it's largely experience-based, so the more experienced people generally are thought to be better at it. It's not very highly paid, so there tends to be a pretty good turnover rate at the lower levels. you're starting to put together the picture that this is the sweet spot.
Right.
There's huge amounts of money at risk in the aggregate. These portfolios for a Wells Fargo or American International Group are, you know, in the billions.
Right.
That's the sweet spot. So it took some months of digging around, and Steve somehow or other would figure out who these people are and get us in the door, and then I would do the interviewing and so forth. And after looking at all these different areas like foreign exchange, commodity, and so forth, we concluded this really was the sweet spot. It had scale. There was expertise. The expertise could be syndicated, could be distributed to lower skilled professionals. It was not purely statistical. There's a half a dozen things, rate and weight. You know, you're a white male in this zip code and your driving record is this is your premium. And so we jumped in, and we got partners. Sheldon Briner did the fundraising to his credit. We got something like $6.something million in the first round that included.
Did you work with most of that from a particular investor or venture fund?
No. We had several. We had several investors.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a blue ribbon premier board. Our lead investor was Sequoia Capital, Arthur Rock, who was still active at that time. I mean, it was a blue ribbon, a blue chip group of investors. As I said, Shelley Briner was the first guy in the door because he was somewhat known in that community because he had a successful startup at some scale. I was basically the due diligence person. Steve and I were the ones who actually knew what was going on, to tell you the truth. Sheldon had some knowledge, but didn't have, you know, deep knowledge. And so we raised $6 million in the first round, and we quite quickly got partners from the best of the banks and the insurance companies. Wells Fargo was an early partner, and Wells, even then, notwithstanding its recent tarnishing, was really still is a very good bank.
Right.
American International Group was considered the underwriter's underwriting company. They made a fetish of underwriting. There's really only two things an insurance company does: they underwrite risk and they invest the. And so going back to their famous chief executive. It was the premier underwriting company, again, commercial levels, what's called commercial lines of insurance, property and casualty, liability, slips and falls, workers' compensation, that sort of thing, property, fire, and so forth. And we got to work, we really got to work with a will. There were some huge intellectual challenges and one huge legal challenge. The intellectual challenge is we thought we'd take PROSPECTOR, which I've described at length, and just apply it. We discovered it was nowhere remotely applicable to the demands.
It was just
not remote.
going there.
So we had two brilliant technical people, my dear colleague René Ribeau, who was the principal programmer for PROSPECTOR and now sadly gone. And he had found us, and we had recruited to SRI another brilliant Swedish computer scientist named Tore Risch. And Tore left SRI and went with us, and they were the two key software people, and Dick Duda was the key theoretician. And we created a completely new language called Syntel, which I'm convinced today, if we had been academics and had generations of graduate students, I'm convinced it would be a fixture on the landscape. It was a functional programming language that used functions over relations. Relations you can think of as being like tables, like a relational database, with probability theory layered on top. So, for example, if you said, for example, profit equals revenue minus cost, but we're talking about future profit, so we have only a probability distribution over future revenue and only a probability distribution over future cost. What's the probability distribution over future profits? Syntel will compute that for you in a heartbeat. So it was a totally different knowledge representation, not remotely rule-based, or only by courtesy, a bit of a stretch. We had all these different types of functions, including judgmental ones that allowed underwriters the expert underwriters to put in their judgment about how one thing affected another. I didn't have too much to do with it, so it's not personally boasting for me to say I think it was brilliant, a tour de force. I think we had exactly one refereed publication in maybe communications of the ACM, because man, we were busy trying to build stuff. We were not researchers writing papers and giving talks.
Right.
But anybody who is interested can look up this Syntel. I think the authors, I think I was probably a co-author, Dick Duda, Tori Risch, R-I-S-C-H, Rene Reboh, R-E-B-O-H. I think it was just masterful. It had so many refinements. It had an incremental compiler that would allow knowledge engineers to compile their knowledge base incrementally so it could run fast. The knowledge engineering environment was Lisp machines, but the runtime environment was pure vanilla IBM, CICS, MVS. We had IBM terminals running as bitmap displays looking like a Lisp machine. We had platoons of IBM visitors wasting our time because they couldn't believe that a CICS system looked like a bitmap display and not a character-oriented line-by-line kind of thing. So there were some brilliant people on the software engineering side. Eric Kinser was a key guy, Jonathan Cedar, another key guy, who built out the IBM environment brilliantly. So the stuff could run with the database management systems. It was a huge effort. It worked.
How long did that development take?
It must have taken us at least 3 years. We started in '83. I think our first real develop might have been '86 or something like that. It was a huge effort, beginning with the recognition that PROSPECTOR had nothing to do with this. It didn't, it was the proverbial hammer with the wrong nail. So we, being mostly not me, I invented one subsystem. I take credit for the explanation subsystem, which was required to give confidence to why did I come up with this?
Right.
That was required to give confidence to the underwriters who were using it. I invented that little piece. Good for me. I had nothing to do with the big chunks. It was all these other individuals who I mentioned. So that was fabulous. I mentioned there was one legal challenge.
Yes.
So we were patenting stuff. Now picture this. Here we are, the AI software geniuses and the knowledge engineering. I was always the first guy on the door in knowledge engineering because I said that was kind of my intellectual personality. I could talk to anybody about their stuff and I elicit the first things. But then eventually we had a whole squad. We had, I don't know, a dozen or 2 dozen knowledge engineers. So now picture this. We are working with you, American International Group, to encode your knowledge in this carefully constructed knowledge base. And by the way, our PROSPECTOR experience that I described about how you sort of modularize knowledge was very helpful. We did the same thing except with finance. So it's your knowledge in our software and our representation, and representation, as you know, means computationally,
right?
Computational representation, execute. Who do you think should own what? What rights do we have? What rights do you have?
Right.
How do you figure that out?
Right, because that representation is creative work, and it wouldn't have happened otherwise.
But it's your underwriting knowledge.
It's my experience as I'm talking to you. I see the problem.
It's your underwriting knowledge, which we've decanted and put in a computational form using our expensively developed knowledge engineering tools and our foundation, which is the knowledge representation used by the Syntel programming language. Enter another wonderful guy, a unique Silicon Valley talent who you may never have heard of, called Mike Stern. Mike Stern is an attorney. He's an intellectual property attorney, but not a patent prosecution guy. He does intellectual property deals. Mike Stern has a remarkable background. He was a professor of English literature with I think Cambridge or something education in his background. Then he became a reporter for, I think, the Wall Street Journal, the New York with the Washington Post or something like that, if I remember, Mike, before becoming a famous lawyer. He's brilliant, and here's the very best thing about Mike. I used to say that most of the lawyers that I dealt with in my business career, I used to joke, would want to know exactly what I was trying to achieve so that they could tell me why it couldn't be done. I know that's unfair. It's a bit of a parody. But Mike was just the opposite. He would want to know exactly what you're trying to achieve, and he'd figure out how you could do it. And he figured out what the right license terms were, and I don't think that's too germane at this point. I don't remember the excruciating details, but Mike solved that problem, so we had mutually acceptable, to us and our development partners, mutually acceptable terms about who owned what under what conditions. So those license terms were figured out. I will tell you, Mike went on to other fabulous achievements. You've heard of Creative Commons? Yes. Mike, as far as I know, Mike is the lawyer. So that was Larry Lessig's brainchild. Yes. But as far as I know, Mike was the lawyer who actually drafted the license term for all the Creative Commons licenses that we use. And by the way, I use them myself for my bird photographs. And I say, Mike, which one do I need? And he said, use this one. He also was close to a co-founder of General Magic, not quite, but an early employee. So as soon as I knew Mike was leaving his law firm to become that, I knew they had an unusual business plan. And Mike was a producer, executive producer of the just released General Magic film, which just had a premiere in Silicon Valley a week or two ago in San Jose that I went to. So Mike Stern, not a technical person, but another brilliant personality in this story who should not be overlooked or forgotten because he had tremendous intellectual contributions, and he continues to make them.
So you've got all these agreements figured out about the knowledge engineering, and you have the new expert system, new design.
It all worked.
And it works.
It all worked. So here's what happened. So by the late 1980s, the board of directors had decided that we needed a change of CEO. And so we got basically a CEO who was a banking industry, very high-end software sales executive named Don Steele, S-T-E-E-L-E. And he had a whole crew of people who had sold these very high-end systems to the banking industry and knew the players. And you have to appreciate that these are institutional sales at the highest level, because this goes to a mission-critical function of any bank or insurance company. Yeah. So not only is it a multi-million-dollar licensing fee and a huge install and so forth, but if you're a bank, all you do is lend money and invest it, and this is the lending part. And if you're an insurance company, you underwrite risk, insurance risk, and you invest the premium money you get. And all we're going to do is to totally revolutionize half of your core business. So it's a very difficult sell, a very lengthy selling cycle, and every sale eventually gets signed off on by essentially the CEO or the chairman of the board or the deputy chairman of the board. It goes to the very, very top of the company. And getting there usually takes 6 months or a year because we have a direct sales force, very high-end. The banking insurance company has huge institutional software systems that they run, so they know these institutional sales. You've got to go up level by level by level by level until you get to you have a sponsor, a hero, and eventually. One time I went to Toronto for lunch, for example, to I think one of the 3 biggest banks in Canada, and I went with our sales guy, and we had lunch. I just went for lunch, and we had lunch at the executive dining room at the top floor of the bank building in downtown Toronto. Had lunch with I think it was either the chairman or the deputy chairman of this very large bank, the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. And we're standing chatting just before sitting down. The 3 of us are there, my sales guy, very high-end, as I mentioned, institutional sales guy, me, and the chairman or whatever. And without batting an eye, this guy he points to my sales guy, and he looks me in the eye, and he says to me, "I know he'll lie to me." He says to his face. He says, "I know he'll lie to me. I want to know from you, can you deliver?" I looked him in the eye and I said, "Yes." And we signed the deal. the salesman got a huge commission check. He didn't worry at all about being insulted. You need a very thick skin for those kind of sales roles. In any case, so here's what happened. So there was kind of a change at the top and the sales level, the direct sales level, which maybe was a little bit painful for a founder, but did the trick. Mm-hmm. And so by the late 80s, we had both major banks and insurance customers in 4 countries, basically all the major English-speaking countries in the US, Canada, England, and Australia. We were profitable for several years, both profitable and cash positive for several years in the late 1980s. Not only do we have customers, we had satisfied customers. In the Canadian bank alone, we were told we had a hero. We had a senior VP who had believed and who had promoted the sale, and I went to this lunch and inked the deal. And a year or whatever later, I think he told us, I can't remember what they said, we had either 5,000 or 10,000 login names. I guess our guys would have known. No, they would have known because they ran our software ran on their IBM facilities. Right. They had a provision for that and so forth. Either 5,000 or 10,000 login names. They had a huge distributed, Canada's a sparsely populated country, very distributed. And he told us that at that point I had that conversation, they had evaluated something like $10 or $15 billion of potential financial transactions using our system. Now you might say it was only Canadian dollars, but it was still a lot of money. That's not the number of deals they did, that's the number of deals they evaluated. So we were successful. This unique technology worked. The IBM delivery environment, which I described, was very complicated, difficult, and groundbreaking with these bitmap displays in an IBM 3270 or whatever terminals. It all worked. And so we were on a January fiscal, and I remember Christmas party in, I guess it would have been December of '89. We were really optimistic. As I said, we had been profitable for, I can't remember, several years, cash positive as well as profit, as well as book profitable. We said, we can go for a year without selling a thing. We have so much cash in the bank. And that's what happened. In 1990, there was a recession, which at the time was considered the most, before 2008, was considered the most serious recession of the post-war era, as I recall. It was especially severe in the financial services sector, which was my market. And I remember reading these quotes from CEOs of banks and insurance companies saying, we're not going to make any capital investments for a year. We're just in a cash conserving mode. It's, we're acquire or be acquired, and either way we're not making capital investments. We're just conserving cash. That's it, period. And I thought, this is going to be really bad. We could sell nothing for a year. And so Syntelligence, ultimately I was the only officer of the company willing to take Syntelligence through a Chapter 7, which happened in '91. But
I don't know what Chapter 7 is.
Chapter 7 is, Chapter 11, which you always hear about, is a reorganization. It's like put everything on hold, we'll consolidate debts, and we'll keep going and reorganize. That's what happened. Chapter 7 just means shut it down. Okay. Pay off whoever you can with whatever asset you have, shut it down. It's the end. So that was the end of the dream. But what I will say, it was not because of the AI winter, which it's sometimes been confused with. Yes. Nothing to do with the AI winter. Nothing to do with over-promising and under-delivering. In fact, my mantra was always the opposite: under-promise and over-deliver. Things work out better that way. Nothing about not having happy customers, nothing about being ineffective. There was this huge recession, and that was that. I think if not for that recession, I think Syntelligence undoubtedly would have continued to go up the curve and most likely would have been acquired by who knows whom.
A huge downdraft in the financial sector, and with this kind of bespoke sales for a system of this kind where your software kind of is the bank in some ways.
And it's something you can do, it's something, it's not essential. It's a way to do better. But it's like, you know, we were struggling before, we can probably struggle along the same way. So it's an easy no and a hard yes.
So why did you choose 7 rather than 11?
Chapter 11?
Yeah.
Because there was no way. Chapter 11, you have to have some path forward. You have to have some financing, some reason to believe you can turn the company around. If you can put your creditors on hold, you can rejuvenate the company. But the typical venture company, we're not public, don't forget, the typical venture company is not, if it fails, it goes out of business. So you may not have heard that Chapter 7 term, but every time you learn about a venture company closing, it's probably it's probably that. I mean, not a bankruptcy.
And the investors wouldn't have been a practice to say.
Well, by that time we had raised several additional rounds. I think we raised a total of somewhere approaching $25 million in several rounds. And I've given an occasional talk at places like Zero Park on this, not recently. And I say, well, there's bad news and good news. And I talk about succeeding and failing in AI in multiple decades. I talk about this chapter, and what's the bad news? Well, the bad news is we lost $25 million. Well, with that bad news, what could the good news possibly be? Well, it was somebody else's money. So.
Well, just, I mean, I guess this may be a naive viewpoint, but, you know, you have a good system that works, you have a good group of people, you have demonstrated success. There's a kind of a, you know, there's a sharp downturn in the financial industry. Of course, in retrospect, we know that, of course, you know, you don't know how long the trough is going to last, but, you know, why throw that, from the investor standpoint, why don't I just keep this on life support through the trough and then gear up?
That's the perfect question. That's why you're so good at this job. It's the perfect question. There was a kind of a caboose to that train. So what happened was our largest customer, and eventually pretty big investor, was the largest commercial insurance company in Great Britain, then called the Sun Alliance. I think it might now be called the Royal and Sun Alliance after more mergers. And they were both an investor and a major customer. And they were, as one of my opposite numbers there said, just because we're big doesn't mean we're not fleet, he said in perfect British English. And so they acquired the assets, and the core team, not including the executive team, we were all out. And they kept that going as a separate company for a while. It might have been called Syntelligence Systems or something like that. I think they had an office in Mountain View somewhere. And they did keep that going, probably mainly to support their install, but they had a very big install. I used to go visit them in Sussex. In fact, I set up an office in the south of England mainly to support them in Red Hill in Sussex. For a while, I would go there. And that eventually ended, but by then I was really not part of that. It was very clear. And so I don't really know exactly what happened or how it ended or where the software went.
So one investor did make that decision to keep it going. And who knows, they could have, although it would be maybe awkward for them to have customers in their same...
in their space?
Field, but maybe not for, or spin it back out or something.
Yeah,
you know,
or,
so somebody
or some other country.
Maintain that investment.
No, that's why I think your question was very insightful. That's exactly right. And as I say, I was probably close to persona non grata, maybe not literally, but it was clear I was not part of that. And so I really don't know exactly what happened, how long did it survive, where did the software go, where did people go, I just don't know.
Well, what did you do then?
So, amazingly enough, just as I was taking Syntelligence through this shutdown, which I can tell you was not a pleasant experience, and I don't recommend it as a steady form of entertainment. I got a call from Charlie Rosen. And you have to remember, as I started to say, that the late 1980s was a time when lots of offshore technical companies, Japanese and European, were setting up satellite research centers somewhere around Silicon Valley. There was kind of a burst of activity in the late 1980s. And against that backdrop, just as I was going through this winding down process, I get a call from Charlie Rosen saying, "Hey, Pete, I'm working with some folks up at Sand Hill Road who need some help, and I think you're the person who can help them." So that was timely, since I could see that probably I would need to do something next. And so it turned out that Charlie had been consulting for a large, or a medium-large Japanese company called Ricoh, spelled R-I-C-O-H, which in the consumer market was mostly known for cameras, but at the time was the world's largest fax manufacturer at a time when fax mattered, and was mainly in the office machine business, which is copiers, printers, and faxes with different technologies at different eras. And I had barely heard of it. They were sort of a Canon and Xerox competitor. So, well, I guess I should go meet. So what happened was that Ricoh had set up a smallish research center on Sand Hill Road, not months, not years earlier. I don't know the exact early timing, but not much earlier. And they had hired, as we learned to say, a local person to head it. Local person, I don't want to say American, because who's American? It's somebody from who's in Silicon Valley now. Right. So a local person, and that was itself very unusual, because I was aware of any number of other, as I say, mainly Japanese and European labs that have been set up, and they always sent an expat from the home, from the mothership, from the headquarters or whatever, to be the top person in the local Silicon Valley satellite lab. And this was very unusual, because here was a local person who had been hired to do this, and it actually was somebody I was distantly acquainted with through some past professional interaction someplace or other. And they decided, Ricoh decided that it wasn't a good fit, and so now they were looking for somebody to take over that position. That first leader had already, at the time they contacted me, was already gone from the scene, and they needed somebody to do what amounts to being a restart. It had only been a matter of months, a few people were there, they needed a restart. So that began a discussion. I met with some people here, visited the lab, and two things happened with respect to the timing. One was that I really needed to finish winding down Syntelligence. I mean, I had an obligation there, even though it wasn't very pleasant, and that was going to take some months. And the other was I would be happy to learn more about this place before, throwing in my lot with them. And so we arranged for me to do a kind of a pretty intensive consulting gig for 2 or 3 months or whatever it was, by which I spent close to a day a week, at least a half a day, if not a day a week there, really get into things in quite some depth, talking to all the technical people at considerable depth about their projects, the technology, what they were trying to accomplish, how they're going about it, what the key challenges were, so on and so forth. So I really had a very, very good handle on exactly what was going on in this lab. There was quite a spread of talent, because it was a competitive recruiting environment, which is to say nothing different from ever around here. And there was quite a spread of talent. And so in the end, I agreed to go there full time, and stayed full time in that position, and some expansions that I can get into later. I stayed with Ricoh for the following about 15 years or a little more. something along on those lines. And that was just a fabulous gig. It was just like wonderful.
And what was when you joined to do the restart, what was kind of the remit or the boundaries or the mission of the operation? Which areas of technology were?
It was pretty much up to us. I maybe tell you a little bit about the backdrop.
Sure.
So I said Ricoh was kind of a medium-large, not the biggest by any means, Japanese company, but big enough to have lots of resources and operations in, 80 countries or whatever it was. At the time, the executive vice president, one of 2 or 3 executive vice presidents in the very top of the technology pyramid in the company, was another one of these wonderful world citizens, remarkable individuals, sort of a Charlie Rosen level, spectacular individual named Dr. Morio Onoe, O-N-O-E. I still regard him as just a wonderful world citizen, brilliant technologist, had been at the, I guess it was University of Tokyo, I think, a piece of it there. I think not long after World War II had come to the US, if I recall his background, as some sort of student or intern, which was like remarkable that soon after the war. Just a remarkable individual. And he was the one who had decided 2 things. First, we're going to have a local person run this operation. And second, when the first hire turned out to be not a bad person, but just not a good match, he was going to stay the course. It wasn't the wrong strategy. It was hiring infelicity. Yeah. And he, in turn, had sent another person who became a very dear friend of mine, and also sadly passed away too young, named Dr. Koichi Ejiri, spelled E-J-I-R-I. And Koichi, as he insisted on everybody calling him Koichi, was another one of these true world citizens whose outlook extended far beyond any nationality or country boundary or technology boundary. He was a brilliant technologist, a prolific inventor, and just you know, if there were more like him, the world would be a better place. And so my first introductions were to these 2 absolutely remarkable world-class individuals. And I thought, boy, if we have the right ground rules, the right institutional understandings about what's expected and what autonomy lies where, if that can be set up in some way that doesn't prevent success,
right,
this could be great, because I know how to fix all these other problems. I've got competence dribbling that at my fingertips to how do you run something like this. The key thing is, what's the relationship with the funding organization, the parent company? What are the expectations? What are the obligations? What is the level of trust? Right. Those are the intangibles that are really hard to assess, but that absolutely control success. You know, if that's not right, you're being set up to fail no matter what else is going on. Right. So I rather quickly satisfied myself that this is really a fantastic opportunity. I've been around long enough. I don't need to look at anything else. Normally I would say, well, I've got to look at several things. You know, what does any reasonable person do? Right. Create some options, pick the best one, compare. No. I know what I'm looking at. So, yeah, so that was accomplished, and you know, that really was a wonderful match and a wonderful experience for me at for the end of my full-time professional employment. Now I'm part-time.
How did you, I mean, what was that relationship with the broader company? How did you negotiate those expectations and obligations?
I didn't have to negotiate anything.
Oh.
They, being the managers that had responsibility, And I always taught people, I have written some stuff for internal consumption about this, about how one of the most difficult positions for technology manager in a corporation is the top technology person in a relationship to the top general manager.
Yeah.
Because I always explain to people, I teach people that companies have only two kinds of activities, money making and money spending. In biz school, they're called profit centers and cost centers. That's just polite. We're a money spending operation. We get funded by the money making operations. Do you think we owe them any obligation? And so how the top technical person relates to the top general management, or by extension the top layer or two, but especially for the top, is really critical. And if there's a level of trust there, then you really can be very effective. So once again, I was in a position where don't tell me what you need, what you want. I'm going to tell you what you need, and I will figure out what you need. And of the things that you need, I will figure out what I can contribute given realities of budget, time scale, and so on and so forth, disciplinary focus. You can't be all things to all people, and so on and so forth. That's my responsibility. And of course, I'm going to recruit a lot of help from my organization to make sure we do that well. It's not, just my concepts. But I'll make sure that that work ethic and that philosophy permeates every single person in my organization. We have a lot of rope. We can have and we did specifically manage a time distribution of projects, so there's some nearer term deliverables and so much longer term, higher payoff, higher risk kind of thing. So there's a distribution. We think about that a lot. But that's our responsibility to do that in a way that both allows us to make progress, allows us to develop our own careers, and also provides benefit for the organization that's supporting us in lots of ways, and of course financially, but more than just financially. And what I used to tell people is that, what all I want is an opportunity to do good and have fun, and you need both. Either one by itself isn't good enough. So
what are some of the standout developments that from that laboratory?
Okay. Well,
for
whole
you?
Whole bunch. From very early on, we pretty quickly remixed the staff, and I rarely, if ever, had to actually discharge anybody. Pretty soon people figured out this new guy, Hart, was like a different deal, maybe I should leave. And some people who were just really not suited for a research environment just figured out this is not the way, So it didn't take long to really rebuild the staff with really, really good people, really super good people. So what sort of accomplishments? So that was one of the earlier parts of JPEG, early days of JPEG. We invented a JPEG implementation, a standard compliant JPEG implementation that could keep up with HDTV rates, that was super, super fast, and it was done by just incredibly clever engineering, like half-register arithmetic and round-offs that didn't hurt anything, and approximations that were still JPEG compliant, and with the chip technology of the day, and Ricoh had a chip division at that point, we could make super fast JPEG chips. We invented JPEG 2000. That was actually our sole invention, and I invested probably more money than I should have over 5 years to make that an ISO standard. And we had our reasons, and the commercial outcome is whatever it is, but that was something. I took my interest in expert systems, and with a wonderful, at that time, very young guy named Jamie Graham, who just super talented, and has gone on to accomplish so many great things. But Jamie and I were a two-man project to create a system that was intended to support Ricoh's help desk operators. So, help desks are a very big deal. They're, front-facing, the corporation's face to the customer. They're often positions that have high turnover and not super high skill levels. So you need very good software to support that help desk operator in his or her, often her, interactions with a remote customer.
Right.
And so Jamie and I will say it was mainly my ideas, but Jamie did 100% of the implementation. we invented a novel twist on expert systems that we labeled query-free information retrieval. And the idea was we could complement an expert system. This is a diagnostic expert system. You know, somebody calls the operator and says, hey, my copier is making black streaks, what do I do? And so on, and then you take it from there, and the help desk operator is supposed to get to the bottom of that as quickly as possible, have the customer fix it if possible, if essential, send a guy in a truck or something like that, but hopefully last resort, et cetera. So we had a diagnostic expert system, which was Bayesian reasoning expert system, but we coupled that with an information retrieval system that hooked into Ricoh's entire maintenance library. So there's a zillion models of our widgets out there, and every model has thick maintenance manuals, typically loose leaf, written with big fonts and loads of diagrams, and the technician or the help desk operator might need to pull the right volume out and flip it the right part and say, oh, you know, I can explain to the customer what to do. In the worst case, if you need a repair person, the repair person at least should go out with the right parts in the truck. Otherwise, it's 2 trips.
Right.
So we figured out this method for, invented this system that I provocatively labeled query-free information retrieval, by which we could figure out what piece of documentation was most relevant to the consultation at exactly that point, and we could unobtrusively post some little icon that doesn't disturb the operator or the user or kind of get in the way of the interaction. But if you want, tap here, we'll pull the right volume off the shelf, we'll open it up to the right page, we'll highlight the right paragraph or often the right figure and say, look over there and talk about that next. And so that was a big deal. That system was used in our Chicago area. They called it the National Telecommunications Center, but it was a help desk for I think like 10 years.
Okay.
Got taken over. Ricoh established, Ricoh being Jamie and me, established a pretty impressive patent position on this because we thought this was a big deal. So I don't know how many patents we have in that space. You're familiar with patent positions or patent thickets, they're sometimes called. So we didn't stop with one. I don't know how many there are, but several. Eventually, later, I hired a wonderful young guy who had just finished a PhD dissertation at the MIT Media Lab, I think it was, in an area that was related to this. And so he had done all the academic work and this stuff, and not too much here. And I asked him, I said, by the way, he said, oh yeah, you know, we know about your and Jamie's stuff, and Jamie was next door to him at that point or whatever. I said, you know, you've had to at least do some literature research just to check that box off on your dissertation. He said, oh yeah, yeah. I said, is there anything earlier than that? He said, no, we think you're the first ones. As far as the MIT Media Lab knows, you were the first guys to do this sort of query-free, and it's very generalizable. The only requirements in terms of that technology, probably smarter people than me have done better things by now. But the key requirement is the user has to be in what the user interaction specialists sometimes call a task-oriented dialogue. So you're not just sitting down at your computer and booting it up and the computer says, oh, I know what you're going to try to do.
Right.
No idea. Right. But if you're engaged, if there's in a particular application where there's a well-understood objective you're trying to achieve, and in our case it was diagnose the malfunction and then prescribe a fix. Yeah. So it's task-oriented. There's a well-defined objective, and you're trying to, you the user, trying to get step by step to that, then this stuff can work. Because then we know, we the computer program know where you are and so forth, and this process and what might be most useful and so on and so forth.
So is the person in the call center, the help desk operator, representative, whatever you call it, are they have a computer in front of them, and are they are they inputting answers to questions on the screen to
yeah,
guide
yeah.
that narrowing to?
Yeah, and we're
Okay.
actually guiding the interaction. So the first thing the operator will ask is, well, what model do you have, ma'am or sir? Oh, I've got this particular printer or whatever it is, or copier or some multifunction machine. So then now we have the right knowledge base and so forth.
I see.
Okay, what seems to be the problem? Oh, it's jamming too much, or it's making black streaks, or it's coming out with splotchy printout even though I have a new toner cartridge, or stuff like that.
Got it.
So our expert system, this is before the query-free information retrieval, will compute what's the most valuable next question to ask. So we'll have a procedure. Again, we have an explicit network, like I mentioned from PROSPECTOR. We will do a calculation behind the scene that says the next most valuable question in terms of narrowing the possibilities, ask the user this. And so normally it's a very small number of questions. It's not usually 10 or 15. Maybe it's, I'm going to guess, 3 or 4 or 5 or something like that. Not a huge number of questions. And that's the way the dialogue will proceed. So we, the computer program, know what the user's trying to accomplish, as I've emphasized, and where we are in the diagnostic interaction, and what the next best question is to ask, and what documentation is relevant, because we have the great thing about maintenance documentation is that the table of contents is extremely detailed. It's typically a multi-level, may go down 4 or even more levels to the paragraph things. So your TOC is a wonderful index into the semantics. And you can do an analysis of the TOC to figure out, oh, go here and so forth. And that stuff not only worked, but it's really it's the only research project I've ever personally participated in that worked much better than I thought it would, much sooner than I thought it would. And I just give Jamie all the credit. He's remarkable. If somebody's watching this and can hire Jamie Graham, go hire him.
So it seems like just a, well, how big did the laboratory become?
I don't remember. There were multiple incarnations. The research center itself might have gotten to 40-ish or something. But then we started we did a number of other things. At one point, we spun the research center out of Ricoh's major North American subsidiary. Ricoh, like all multinationals, has hundreds of subsidiaries. There's a huge North American one, and I was a senior vice president of that. We spun it out from that umbrella and became a direct subsidiary of Ricoh Company Limited, which is the parent in Japan. So I went from being senior vice president of the North American subsidiary to be president and chairman of the board and president of Ricoh Innovations, Inc., a California corp that was a subsidiary of the parent in Japan. Several other things happened that made your question more complicated than you imagined. I had a long sequence of bosses. Probably every year there'd be a new top technical person in Japan. Dr. Onoi eventually retired. And one time, I was fortunate enough to have my direct boss, Sakurai-san, who was the president of Ricoh Europe, and another one of these absolutely remarkable world citizens. I think you could take Sakurai-san and parachute him into any country on the face of the earth, and in 30 days he'd be working super effectively and doing whatever needed to be. And just a wonderfully adventurous intellect. I mean, just another one of these just really world-class people. And he and I developed a very good relationship when he became my boss. And then a year later, he became the CEO of all of Ricoh. And sometime after that, chairman and CEO of all of Ricoh worldwide. And one day I get a call from Tokyo, from Sakurai-san. His English was excellent. Peter-san, and we chat a little bit, and he says, he wants me to do something. Yes, sir, Mr. Sakurai. Sakurai. And so what happened was he decided, Ricoh has a category, like all large Japanese companies, of senior vice president, called a Shiko Yakuin in Japanese, which is a certain type of senior vice president. It's a corporate officer of the parent company. And he said he wanted me to become a senior vice president of the parent company, in addition to be chairman and president of the subsidiary in California. And that would involve some additional responsibilities, and would I please do that? And of course, everything in the Japanese business environment, I mean, people had many questions for me about that. I found it fabulous. I worked very comfortably in it, very effectively. I felt wonderful people, for the some exceptions, but for the most part, wonderful people I met and worked with. Sakurai-san being a great example. So I said, of course, I'd be very happy to. And so the next thing I know, I'm the first non-Japanese person to become a corporate officer of Ricoh Company Limited, which existed since the 1930s. And I troll around the web at the time. I don't know the exact time. It would have been mid-90s, or I don't remember exactly, late 90s. I can't remember exactly when. But at least at that time, I could not find very many Westerners who were corporate officers of major Japanese multinationals. There were some, you know, I'm not a student of that. I didn't do an exhaustive study, but it wasn't common. Okay. And that started a new phase of my Ricoh career, because then I had this kind of front row participant seat at the senior executive level of a major Japanese company. And so that was just fabulous. And, you know, I contributed as best as I was able, and I learned a ton and had a wonderful time.
Was your role evaluating kind of the technical situations around the globe and all the various operations, or what?
No, not principally. Occasionally things would come up. For example, somebody would approach Ricoh, would you buy, I won't mention any names even this much later, but for example, some well-known technology company was trying to get acquired by Ricoh, and Ricoh would point individual at me and say, Peter-san, please evaluate this and tell us whether we should seriously pursue it. In some cases, there were household names that I don't want to repeat even now. But that was just a little side job. The most ongoing thing was fascinating is that Ricoh, I don't know how long it went on for, before or after my tenure, but during my tenure, Ricoh had a practice, Ricoh being Ricoh Company Limited, the parent in Tokyo, of having twice a year, semi-annual meetings they called worldwide global strategy meetings. And so the top tier of Ricoh executives worldwide, which would be maybe 30 or 40, something like that, maybe it got a little bit bigger in later years, would meet someplace. Sometimes we do a complete offsite, like the equivalent of a Silmar, but like a Japanese equivalent of Silmar, something like that, or sometimes it's just a very nice Ricoh facility. And we meet for maybe 2.5 days, and there'd be a defined agenda with maybe 2 or 3 topics under discussion, and there'd be some plenary meetings, and then there'd be breakout sessions with smaller groups, half a dozen or 10 or whatever, in these breakout meetings, and you consider whatever topic it was, and then the group would report back to the plenary thing, very much like you've seen in symposium or technical conferences. And the first 2 or 3 that I attended, I can't remember when it changed, I was the only non-Japanese person in these meetings, and there's a beautiful conference facility in, I think it was Gotemba or something like that. I'm sure I was the only Westerner in the village. The first few, the documentation was in English, because the documentation was distributed worldwide to executives worldwide, so English was the internal language of the company outside of Japan, of course. So the documentation was English, but not the discussions. Right. And so I always had a Japanese, at least 1, sometimes 3, full-time home company Japanese support people working with me daily, called, they would be, I had a succession, every one of them was different, everyone was fabulous. And so that person would be there to, quote, support me. So they whispered the translations in my ear so I could participate. Later on, when there started to be like 2 European executives were nominated to this sort of exalted parent company officer position, then we started having UN-style simultaneous translations. And Ricoh would hire a team of simultaneous translators in a soundproof booth and wireless headsets and mics and so forth, and I'd speak in English in Japan, and everything would be simultaneously. But that was later. Yeah. So, but I mentioned this partly because maybe for some future audience this was really interesting, and I thought it was fabulous. I mean, it was so interesting, and you're really working on meaty problems, and everybody's really trying to make some progress or breakthrough, or what do we do about this or that opportunity or issue or whatever it might be of the day. So it was just so interesting, and of course the socialization was fabulous. One of the places we used to go would have a karaoke in the basement in one of these beautiful conference grounds, and afterwards the then CEO and chairman Hamada-san would come down with me and take me by the arm, and there'd be 3 activities. He said, "Peter-san, let's do karaoke." And so we do that, we drink beer, and I do a karaoke number, but never in Japanese, because even though I studied a lot of Japanese, but I do it in Spanish, because that was, like a neutral. And then people say, "Oh, Peter-san, you have a good spirit." What is it? A good spirit of public service, Did you? And it was just so much fun and so interesting. But in terms of what I contributed, this was a lot of. I'm telling you about a lot of affect, and you can see that I thought it was wonderful.
Really loved it.
But in terms of did I actually contribute anything, I'll give you one comment. So one time, one of my wonderful chuzain, that's the local person Japanese person who would, sometimes it worked for as long as 5 or 8 years, sometimes a few years. One time, Shinadachi, his name was, another one of these wonderful people who assisted me. He said to me, coming out of one of these meetings, he said to me, "Peter-san," he said, "every time your opinion or your recommendation is different from all the other Japanese executives." And I say, "Well, Shin, now that you mention it, I guess you're right. But I want you to know, it's not because I'm trying to be different. If I'm asked for my opinion, I'm happy to offer it. And if it happens to be different from everybody else's opinion, okay." So in the context of your question, David, possibly there was a contribution there. And I worked very, very hard to be understandable in English. I actually wrote a chapter for my folks about how to be understandable in English.
That's very wise.
And what to do and not do, and it's easy. And it's just, I'm kind of a natural mimic, and I naturally adapt in the environment that I'm in. It just takes a little bit of observation.
Yeah.
And I keep my graphics bold and my words on a slide minimal.
Yep.
And I don't want to sound boastful, but this is one interesting touchstone on what is it like that. So Hamada-san was the chairman and CEO at the time that I was first recruited, and remained at least as chairman and then executive advisor for quite a few years. One time I was giving an executive briefing on something that I thought was an extremely important direction for Ricoh to move. This would have been in the late 90s, something called information appliances. And why that was important, and I'll get to that, because then I eventually started a subsidiary to do that. Yeah, another subsidiary. So I did this pitch in Tokyo, and there might have been 30 top-level executives in the room, beginning with Hamada-san, who was the #1 guy, and 100% of the next 2 levels down, or whatever it was. And at the end, Hamada-san was famous for asking what the people called Hamada-san questions, like, "Why is the sky blue?" or something, and he was famous for these. He was very strategic, very insightful guy, another terrific guy. And he sort of wonders out loud, and of course, it's such a hierarchical culture that people are hushed. He speaks. Hamada-san is almost like he's talking to himself. And he says, why, he was a fairly good English speaker. He's understood more English than most of the Japanese people recognized, but he wasn't totally fluent. Right. But he was rather good. Yeah. Rather good level of understanding. And he said, and he's saying this in Japanese, and my guy is translating it for me. He's saying, why is it that he can understand Peter-san in English with no translation better than he can understand Ricoh, Japan, technical people in Japanese? Why do you think that is? A Hamada-san style question. Nobody in the room dares answer. And he says, he answers his own question. He says, I think it's because Ricoh technical people use a very, and I'm paraphrasing a translation now, right. So this is not exact, but I think it's the burden of the meeting. He says, I think it's because our technical people use a kind of jargon or in-group kind of slang that even though it's Japanese, they're the only ones who understand it. Mm. And nobody outside that group understands this kind of in-group kind of jargon. And you know, I'm trying very hard to avoid that. So that was my high point as a communicator. And it's this kind of proof that you can be understood if you really make an effort to make yourself understood.